A 6-year-old boy was dying on a cafe floor, and his billionaire father, a man who controlled a tech empire worth $3 billion, was completely useless. Adrian Hayes, the man who never panicked in boardrooms, who never flinched when markets collapsed, stood there frozen, watching his son's lips turn blue, his small hands clawing at his own throat. And the only person moving, the only person in that entire room who didn't fall apart, was a broke, exhausted warehouse worker on the worst blind date of her life. If you've ever wondered whether two broken people can accidentally save each other, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far this story travels. The cafe smelled like dark roast coffee and cinnamon, which Adrian hated. Not because cinnamon was offensive, but because his late wife, Diana, used to burn cinnamon candles every single Sunday morning in their kitchen while she danced badly to Fleetwood Mac and burned the pancakes. And she'd laugh about it every single time, like burning pancakes was the funniest thing that had ever happened to her. She'd been dead for 3 years, and cinnamon still felt like a punch to the throat. He sat at a corner table near the window, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug he hadn't actually drunk from yet, watching November rain drag itself down the glass in slow, indifferent streaks. Chicago in late autumn had a particular kind of cruelty to it, the sky turning the color of old concrete, the wind coming off the lake with the subtlety of a shove. Adrian had lived in this city his entire life, and he'd never quite made peace with November. He checked his phone. 7:03 p.m. She was 3 minutes late. He was already constructing the polite exit strategy. "Thank you so much for coming. I have an early meeting. I'll have my assistant send flowers." The usual architecture of a graceful retreat. This had been his sister Jenna's idea. Jenna, who owned this cafe, Anchor and Elm, and who had apparently decided that 3 years of watching her brother disappear into his work was long enough. Jenna, who had the unique combination of genuine love for Adrian and absolutely zero patience for his self-destruction. She'd cornered him last week in the parking garage of his office building, actually cornered him, like she'd been waiting, and told him that she had someone she wanted him to meet. "I'm not dating anyone," Adrian had said flatly. "I didn't ask if you wanted to. I'm telling you Tuesday at 7. Jenna, Caleb asked me last week why Daddy never laughs anymore." He hadn't had an answer for that. He still didn't. So here he was, Tuesday at 7, sitting in a cinnamon-smelling cafe, waiting for some woman he didn't want to meet, wearing the expression of a man attending his own sentencing. The bell above the door rang. Adrian looked up, and his first thought, the honest, unfiltered one, was that she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. The woman who walked through the door of Anchor and Elm wasn't what he'd expected. He'd been bracing himself, if he was being brutally honest, for someone polished, someone wearing the kind of outfit that communicated effort and ambition, the way the women his business associates kept suggesting to him always did. Women who Googled him beforehand, women who arrived with calculated smiles and the right amount of nervous confidence. This woman looked like she hadn't Googled anything. She was around 30, he guessed, with dark circles under brown eyes that were currently sweeping the room with the specific wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust new situations. Her coat was a plain dark green, slightly too big for her, the collar turned up against the cold she'd apparently just walked in from. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it in under 90 seconds without a mirror. There was a small scar near her left eyebrow. Faint, old, healed clean. She spotted him immediately. Her expression didn't soften. She crossed the cafe in long, quick strides. Not eager strides, more like the walk of someone who'd decided to get something unpleasant over with as efficiently as possible. "Adrian Hayes," she said, less like a greeting and more like a confirmation of bad news. She extended her hand. "Mia Carter." "Mia." He shook it. Her grip was firm, practiced. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Whatever's fast." She sat down across from him and set her bag on the empty chair beside her, then seemed to catch herself and looked up. "Sorry, that was rude. I've had a long day." "It's fine. I'm not usually—" She stopped, seemed to decide something, and looked at him directly. "Look, I think we should be honest with each other. Jenna is one of the kindest people I've ever met, and I owe her more than I can explain, which is the only reason I'm here. But I'm not in a place where I'm looking for anything, romantically, or really at all." Adrian stared at her for a moment. Then, for the first time in possibly weeks, something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. You want to know something strange? That's the most relieved I've felt since I sat down. She blinked. Seriously? I have an assistant who sent me 3 conversational topic prompts before I left the office tonight. I was about to start with question 2. Mia looked at him. What was question 2? What does success mean to you personally? She made a face. That's horrible. I know. She almost laughed, stopped it just short like she'd caught herself. But the tension around her jaw loosened a little. She leaned back in her chair. Okay, so we're agreeing this is just 2 people having coffee because we both owe Jenna something. That's exactly what we're agreeing. She nodded. Fine. She looked around for a server and Adrian waved one over. She ordered black coffee, no sugar, and when the server left, she folded her hands on the table and said, So what do you actually do? Not the Wikipedia version. He looked at her. I run a tech company. I know that part. Jenna mentioned it. I meant, what do you actually do day to day? What does your Tuesday look like before this? Honestly, that was the deal. I had 4 board meetings, 1 investor call that ran 40 minutes over, fired someone I probably should have fired 6 months ago, and ate half a sandwich over my desk at 2 in the afternoon. Lunch at 2. If you're generous, that's grim. It is, he agreed. He was almost surprised by the admission. He spent most of his time around people who expected him to describe his life as exhilarating. What about you? What does your Tuesday look like? Something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of something complicated. I work in a warehouse, loading and inventory. It's a 6 a.m. start. I was on shift for 10 hours today. It's fine, she said, and there was a specific kind of flatness in her voice that told him she'd had that sentence, it's fine, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. It pays rent. Adrian looked at her. She was looking at her hands now, turning her coffee cup in small rotations on the table. There was something in the set of her shoulders. Not quite sadness, more like someone who had gotten very good at carrying weight in a way that looked like nothing at all. He thought briefly that he recognized it. He didn't say so. They talked for 20 minutes, which was longer than Adrian had expected to last. The conversation had the slightly lurching quality of 2 people who were out of practice, which he suspected they both were for different reasons. But it wasn't unpleasant. Mia was blunt in a way that kept catching him slightly off guard, and she asked questions that were actually questions, not performances of interest. When he said something she disagreed with, she said so, without apology and without cruelty. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He was in the middle of explaining something about the company's logistics restructuring. She'd actually asked, which surprised him, when his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it out of habit. The screen read, Jenna, urgent. He frowned and picked it up. The text read, I'm so sorry. Mrs. Pemberton called in sick and I had nobody else. I had to bring Caleb. He's outside with me. I didn't know what else to do. Please don't be mad. Adrian was already out of his chair. He was halfway across the cafe when the door opened and Jenna came in, holding the hand of a small boy bundled into a red winter coat with a Chicago Bears hat pulled down over his ears. Caleb Hayes was 6 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and he was currently looking around the cafe with the bright, unselfconscious curiosity of someone who found everything interesting. He found his father immediately. Dad! He pulled free of Jenna's hand and ran across the cafe, and Adrian crouched down and caught him, and the feeling of his son's arms around his neck was, briefly, the only thing in the world. Hey, buddy. He pressed a kiss to the top of Caleb's hat. What are you doing here? Aunt Jenna had an emergency, Caleb reported solemnly. Mrs. Pemberton has the stomach sick. The stomach sick, huh? Her stomach is sick, that's why. He pulled back to look at Adrian with 6-year-old severity. Are you on a date? I'm having coffee with a friend. Caleb's gaze traveled immediately and without subtlety to Mia, who had stood up from the table and was watching them with the careful expression of someone trying to calibrate where to put herself in a situation she hadn't prepared for. Caleb studied her for a moment. She has a scar, he said, as a neutral observation. Caleb, it's okay, Mia said. She crossed to them and crouched down to Caleb's level, which Adrian hadn't expected. I do have a scar. I got it a long time ago. I'm Mia. I'm Caleb. A pause. How'd you get it? I fell off a bicycle when I was about your age. She wasn't performing warmth. It wasn't that syrupy thing some adults did with small children, where the voice went up 2 octaves and everything became theatrical. She just talked to him like he was a person. It hurt a lot. Then it stopped hurting. Caleb considered this with great seriousness. Did you cry? A little bit. I cry sometimes, he said matter-of-factly. My dad says that's okay. Your dad's right. Caleb seemed satisfied. He turned back to Adrian. Can I have hot chocolate? Sit down first. Let me talk to Aunt Jenna. Jenna had approached with the expression of someone who knew she was guilty and had prepared a full defense anyway. She was 30, 5 years younger than Adrian, with the same dark hair but their mother's anxious eyes. I'm so sorry, she said quietly, catching his arm. I had absolutely nobody else, and I couldn't just leave him. It's fine. He looked at her. I know. She searched his face. How's it going? He glanced back at Mia, who was now sitting back down at the table while Caleb climbed, without invitation and with the total confidence of a child who'd never been told no, into the empty chair beside her and began immediately explaining something to her using his hands. It's actually not terrible, Adrian admitted. Jenna looked at him like he'd said something remarkable. Caleb ordered hot chocolate and received it with the gravity of someone accepting an important award. He sat beside Mia, and initially Adrian expected her to look uncomfortable. The blind date she hadn't wanted had now acquired a child audience. But she didn't. She asked Caleb what grade he was in. She asked whether he had a favorite dinosaur. Caleb, who had strong opinions on dinosaurs, launched into a detailed explanation of why the Spinosaurus was criminally underappreciated in popular culture. Mia listened. She actually listened. Adrian watched her watch his son and felt something he couldn't fully name, something uncomfortable and warm at the same time, like a joint that had been stiff for years and was slowly beginning to move again. He didn't trust it. He'd learned not to trust it. He was reaching for his coffee when Caleb suddenly stopped mid-sentence. At first, Adrian thought he'd just run out of things to say about Spinosaurus, which was unusual. Then Caleb's hands dropped to his sides. Then Adrian heard it, the sound that had lived in his nightmares every day since Caleb's first reaction at age 3. A high, shallow wheeze, the kind of sound that should not come from a small child's chest. Caleb? Adrian was out of his chair immediately. Caleb, look at me. Caleb looked at him. His eyes were beginning to water. One hand came up and touched his throat in the instinctive, confused way children do when something wrong is happening inside their bodies, and they don't have the language for it. My throat, he started, and the word came out wrong, compressed, like something was pressing it from the outside. He ate the hot chocolate, Mia said, and she was already standing, already looking at the cup on the table. Her voice was different now. Not cold, but stripped down to function. Does he have a nut allergy? Yes. Tree nuts, we always check. The whipped cream, Jenna said from 3 feet away, her face going white. Oh God, the new supplier. I changed cream suppliers last week. I didn't check the allergen sheet. Adrian heard her distantly. He was on his knees in front of Caleb, whose face was flushing an alarming red, whose breathing was getting worse with every second. The wheeze was louder now. Caleb's hands were shaking. EpiPen, Mia said. Does he have one on him? In a bag? In your coat? In my jacket. Adrian's hands went to his jacket, and for one horrifying second he couldn't remember which pocket. His mind just went blank. Blank like a screen that had lost power. He'd had the EpiPen for 3 years. He'd practiced using it. He knew exactly what to do. And standing here in this cafe with his son's lips beginning to lose their color, he could not, for the life of him, get his hands to work. Adrian, Mia's voice, level and direct. Not unkind, just clear, like a lighthouse in fog. Which side? Left, inner pocket. She was there. Her hands went into his jacket without hesitation, and she had the EpiPen out in 2 seconds flat, uncapping it with one hand while the other went to Caleb's outer thigh. And she looked at Caleb and said, in a voice so calm it was almost surreal given what was happening, Hey, I need you to be very still for just 1 second, okay? Just 1 second. Can you do that? Caleb, terrified and struggling to breathe, looked at her and nodded. She pressed the EpiPen against his outer thigh and held it. There we go. Right there. You're doing great. You're doing so well. 10 seconds. 15. Adrian was kneeling on the floor of the cafe, gripping his son's hand and watching a stranger save his child's life, with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before, who knew exactly what each second required, and the room had gone completely silent, a dozen cafe patrons frozen in a tableau of collective held breath. 20 seconds. Caleb's wheeze began to ease, just slightly, but enough. His eyes, which had been glassy and panicked, started to come back into focus. Good, Mia said quietly. There you go. Just keep breathing. You're okay. Adrian pulled his son against his chest and pressed his forehead to the top of Caleb's head, and for a long moment, he was just a man on the floor of a cafe holding his kid, breathing. We need to get him to a hospital, Mia said, not loudly, just clearly. Epinephrine buys time. It doesn't end the reaction. He needs to be monitored. She looked at Adrian. Can you stand? He could stand. He didn't feel like he could, but he stood. Jenna was calling 911 from the counter, her voice tight and controlled in the way it got when she was badly frightened. 2 other customers had cleared a path to the door. Someone had already pulled a car around outside. Adrian didn't know who, didn't process it. Mia stayed right beside Caleb, one hand on his back, tracking his breathing with a quality of attention that was precise and quiet and completely unlike the panicked chaos surrounding them. She wasn't performing calm. She just was calm. Or something close enough to it that it held everything around her steady. Outside, in the cold November air waiting for the ambulance, Caleb looked up at her from his father's arms and said, in his slightly hoarse, recovering voice, "Your hands are cold." Mia looked down at her hands, which were indeed bare in the November air. "Yeah," she said, "I forgot my gloves." "I have an extra one," Caleb said, and somehow, absurdly, he managed to pull a small blue mitten from his coat pocket with one hand and hold it out to her. It was a child's mitten. It would not fit her hand. Mia looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. She held the single blue mitten in both hands, and something moved across her face, just for a second. Something that looked like it hurt in a very old and specific way. "Thanks, buddy," she said. At Northwestern Memorial, the ER team took Caleb immediately. Adrian moved through the next 2 hours on pure function, speaking to doctors, signing forms, answering questions about allergen history and medication, sitting beside a hospital bed while his son slept off the antihistamines and the adrenaline and the terror of the whole thing in the boneless, total way that young children sleep. He was sitting in his waiting room when Mia came back from wherever she'd gone. The cafeteria, he thought, she'd mentioned coffee, and sat down 2 seats away from him without saying anything. She set a paper cup down beside him. He looked at it, then at her. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "I know." "Why did you?" She looked at the floor. She had her coat back on, her bag on her lap, her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup. The waiting room was quiet at this hour. The overhead lights, their usual institutional unpleasant. A television in the corner playing muted local news. "I worked in emergency medicine," she said, after a pause that felt like she was choosing the words carefully. "For 6 years. Paramedic." She said it in past tense, deliberate past tense. I wanted to make sure he was okay. That's all." Adrian looked at her profile. She was staring at the middle distance with the expression of someone sitting with something heavy. "You were calm," he said. "I know how to sound calm. That's not—" He stopped. "That's not the same thing. What you were in there, that wasn't performance." She didn't answer for a moment. Then, "Muscle memory. 6 years of it. My brain knows what to do, even when the rest of me isn't sure." She paused. "It doesn't always work like that." Something in the way she said it made him want to ask a question he didn't have the right to ask. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So he picked up the paper coffee cup and drank from it instead. "Thank you," he said. "I need you to know that I mean that in a way that the word isn't quite big enough for." She looked at him then, for the first time since they'd sat down. Her eyes were tired and very direct. "Your son is alive and he's fine," she said. "That's all that happened tonight. Don't turn it into something bigger than it is." He thought that was one of the more extraordinary things anyone had ever said to him. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why did you really come tonight? You said Jenna saved your life. That's not a casual thing to say." Mia was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Outside the window, the Chicago night pressed gray and wet against the glass. A nurse moved through the corridor beyond the waiting room doors. A phone rang somewhere and went unanswered. 2 years ago, she said finally, I was in a car accident. Bad one. Interstate 90, in January black ice. My car went under a semi. She said it without drama, just the sequence of facts. I was technically gone for about 40 seconds. Jenna was the first responder. A breath. She didn't give up. There were people there who would have. She didn't. Adrian said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. So when she asked me to come tonight, Mia continued, I came. Because she's been asking me to get out of my apartment for 8 months and I keep saying no, and this time I figured I owed her enough to say yes once. She looked at her cup. I didn't think it would turn into this. Neither did I. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just present. He said his mom died, Mia said quietly. Caleb, in the car on the way here, he said it out of nowhere. My mom died when I was little, like he just needed to say it. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, opened them. He does that. He just puts it out there, when he's scared or when he's trying to connect with someone. Diana died 3 years ago, brain aneurysm, completely without warning. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I was in San Francisco when it happened. Business. She'd called me the night before and asked me to come home early, and He stopped. You didn't, Mia said. I didn't. She didn't say anything after that. She didn't do the thing people usually did, which was immediately reassure him that he couldn't have known, that it wasn't his fault, that he needed to let it go. She just let it sit there, the fact of it, the weight of it, without rushing to cover it over. He found that more comforting than anything anyone had said to him in 3 years. My husband died 2 years ago, she said a few minutes later, still not looking at him. Marcus. He had a heart attack in our kitchen. He was 31. Adrian turned his head toward her. I was right there, she said, standing 6 feet away from him, the man I trained for 6 years to help in exactly that situation. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And I froze. I stood there and I froze. He didn't say, you couldn't help it. He didn't say, these things happen. He said, and you've been punishing yourself for it ever since. She looked at him sharply, like she hadn't expected that, like she'd been braced for consolation and received something else entirely. Yeah, she said after a moment. Just that one word, but the way she said it was like a very slow exhale after a very long time of not exhaling. They sat in the flat fluorescent light of the waiting room, 2 people who had arrived at the same place from completely different directions, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. It wasn't peace, it wasn't healing, it wasn't anything as clean as that. It was just 2 people who were still figuring out how to be alive, sitting still for a minute, not pretending otherwise. Down the hall, a door opened and a nurse appeared. Mr. Hayes, he's awake and asking for you. Adrian stood. He picked up the paper coffee cup, then looked at Mia. Will you? He stopped. It felt like too much to ask. Never mind. I'll be here, she said. He looked at her. When you come back out, she clarified. She shifted her bag on her lap, matter of fact, like she'd just committed to a very minor thing. I'll be here. He nodded, walked toward the door, stopped just before it, hand on the frame. Mia. He didn't turn around. For what it's worth, what you did tonight, the way you were with him, that wasn't just muscle memory. He pushed through the door before she could argue. Inside the room, Caleb was propped up against 3 pillows in a hospital bed, wearing a paper gown with cartoon rockets on it, attached to a monitor that beeped steadily and assigned him a perfect oxygen level. His Chicago Bears hat was still on his head, which the nurses had apparently found charming enough to allow. When he saw Adrian, his whole face changed. Dad. Just that, nothing else. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed and pulled his son close, and Caleb buried his face against his shoulder, and for a moment Adrian just held him. This small, solid, specific person, this proof that something good had existed, that something good still existed. And the thing inside his chest that had been cracked and frozen for 3 years shifted, just slightly, the way ice shifts in early spring. Still cold, still there. But something underneath it was beginning, very slowly and without permission, to move. You're okay, he said into Caleb's hat. "You're okay." "Mia fixed me," Caleb said against his shoulder, in the certain factual voice of a 6-year-old. "Yeah," Adrian said, "she did." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is she still here?" Adrian looked at the closed door. Through it, somewhere in the waiting room, a woman who had come to a date she hadn't wanted and had accidentally saved his son's life was sitting under fluorescent lights, holding an empty paper coffee cup, waiting. "Yeah," he said, "she's still here." Caleb pulled back slightly to look at his father with the very serious expression he deployed when he had something important to say. "She can stay," he announced solemnly. Adrian looked at his son. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just settled for tightening his hold on him and not answering, which Caleb, being 6 and already tired again, accepted without further argument. Outside, through the window, the November rain had slowed to something quieter. It wasn't enough to call it anything, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, Adrian Hayes decided not to argue with something. They discharged Caleb at 11:30 with a prescription antihistamine, a follow-up appointment card, and a sticker from the pediatric nurse that said "Brave Kid" in yellow letters, which Caleb immediately pressed onto the front of his coat with the satisfaction of someone receiving a medal. The ride home was quiet in the way hospital nights always leave people quiet. Wrung out, grateful, still slightly unsteady. Jenna had gone ahead in her own car, insisting 3 times that she was fine, that she was sorry, that she would fix the allergen labeling at the café first thing in the morning. Adrian had told her to stop apologizing. She'd apologized one more time anyway, and then driven off, which was so entirely Jenna that he hadn't even been annoyed. Mia had said goodbye in the hospital lobby, quiet and brief. She touched Caleb's shoulder once, just once, a light thing, and told him she was glad he was feeling better. Caleb had told her he wanted to show her his dinosaur collection sometime. She'd said maybe, which was neither a yes nor a no, and Adrian had watched her walk out through the automatic doors into the Chicago night and had not called after her because he didn't know what he would have said. He got Caleb home and into pajamas and into bed and sat on the edge of his son's mattress in the dark, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, and didn't move for a long time after that. 3 years ago, sitting in this same room in the dark, he'd made himself a promise. He'd promised himself that Caleb would always be safe, that he would never fail him the way he'd failed Diana, that he would be present, careful, controlled, that he would never again be the man who chose the wrong thing. Tonight, in a cafe that smelled like cinnamon and his dead wife's Sunday mornings, he'd watched his son stop breathing and he'd frozen. All the promises and all the preparation, and when it mattered, he'd frozen. He sat with that for a while, alone in the dark, the way you have to sit with things you can't fix. Then he went downstairs, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't particularly want, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the city below, and thought about a woman with a scar near her eyebrow and cold hands, and 6 years of emergency medicine she'd walked away from, who had done in 10 seconds what he couldn't do at all. He didn't call her. He didn't have her number. He fell asleep on the couch sometime after 2 in the morning with the television on mute, which was how he'd been falling asleep for most of the last 3 years, because the bedroom was still too quiet without someone else in it. In the morning, Caleb was fine. Children have a particular resilience that adults find almost offensive. Caleb woke up bright and hungry, declared he wanted waffles, and spent breakfast explaining to Adrian at length that Spinosaurus was actually semi-aquatic, which he'd apparently told Mia the night before and wanted to make sure his father was also informed of. Adrian made the waffles and listened and said, in the right places, and thought about the fact that his son had talked about Mia twice in the last 8 hours. He thought about that more than he probably should have. He found Mia's number through Jenna, who gave it up with a studied casualness that didn't fool him for a second. He texted, not called, because calling felt like too much, and also because he genuinely wasn't sure what he wanted to say. He typed, "This is Adrian. I wanted to make sure you got home okay last night, and to say thank you again, properly. Not just in a hospital waiting room at midnight." He stared at the message for several seconds before sending it, and immediately felt slightly ridiculous about a sign-off, which was what happened when you hadn't sent a personal text to anyone except your sister in 3 years. She replied 40 minutes later, "I got home fine. How's Caleb?" He typed back to normal. Currently arguing with me about prehistoric marine predators over breakfast. A pause. Then, the Spinosaurus speech. The full version, apparently. Another pause, longer. Then, tell him he's right. It was seriously underrepresented. Adrian read that twice. Then he set his phone face down on the counter and stood there for a moment with his hand still on it, and the feeling in his chest was something he hadn't felt in a long time and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. He picked the phone back up. He'll be insufferable now. Thanks for that. She didn't reply after that, and he didn't push it. Some things you leave where they land. Achi. He ran into her again 4 days later, which he would tell himself for weeks afterward was a coincidence, though he was also self-aware enough to acknowledge that he'd been having his morning coffee at Anchor and Elm every day since the incident, which he hadn't done before it. Jenna had noticed. Jenna was irritatingly good at noticing things. It was a Saturday, late morning, the cafe doing its weekend business, parents with strollers, a couple laptops, a man in the corner reading the actual print newspaper like it was 2003. Adrian was at the counter with his coffee when the door opened and Mia came in, and she stopped when she saw him with the brief expression of someone who had not prepared for this. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He gestured vaguely at the cafe. "I come here." "I know. Jenna mentioned it." A beat. "She also told me you've been coming every day this week." "She talks too much." "She really does." Mia came to the counter and ordered her usual black coffee, and then seemed to make a small internal decision because she picked up her cup and said, "Are you sitting somewhere, or?" "Corner table." "Okay." It wasn't graceful. It wasn't romantic. It was two people with nowhere better to be on a Saturday morning sitting down across from each other again, which was something, even if neither of them could have said exactly what. This time, there was no exit strategy and no assistant-prepared topic prompts. They talked for an hour and a half, and it was different from the first night. Less guarded, maybe, or maybe just differently guarded. The near catastrophe of Tuesday had knocked something loose between them, rearranged the usual social scaffolding that strangers use to manage distance. Mia told him about her job, the warehouse, the early hours, the particular satisfying exhaustion of physical work, and the particular unsatisfying flatness of coming home to an empty apartment afterward. She said it matter-of-factly, not seeking sympathy, just describing the shape of her days. Adrian noticed she talked about her life the way someone talks about a temporary living arrangement, like she hadn't quite moved all the way in. He told her about the company, not the boardroom version, not the investor pitch, but the actual texture of it, the pressure that never fully released, the way success kept moving the goalpost, the fact that he'd built something genuinely significant and felt, on most days, completely hollow about it. "That sounds lonely," she said. "It is." He said it without hesitation, which surprised him slightly. "I've got good people around me. Jenna. A few people at work I actually trust. Caleb." He paused. "But yeah, it's lonely in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't..." He stopped. "Who hasn't lost someone," she said. "Yeah." She nodded slowly. She was looking at her cup again, that habit she had, turning it in small rotations. "People try," she said. "They mean well. They talk about grief like it has an endpoint, like it's a tunnel and you're supposed to be getting closer to the exit." She shook her head slightly. "Mine doesn't feel like a tunnel. It just feels like weather. Some days it's fine, some days it's completely consuming, and it doesn't really care about timelines." Adrian looked at her. "How long has it been? Since Marcus?" 26 months. She said it quickly, like she'd counted it enough times that the number came automatically. "I left the ambulance service 8 months after. Just couldn't go back. Everything about emergency medicine felt like standing in front of a mirror I didn't want to look into." "Do you miss it?" The question sat there. Mia was quiet for long enough that a couple at the next table had their entire exchange about whether to get another round before she answered. "Every day," she said, finally. "I was good at it. Not just competent. I was genuinely good. I had this thing where I could just shut everything external down and be completely present in the emergency. Zero noise." She paused. "Except the one time it mattered most." "You froze," Adrian said. "I froze." Her jaw tightened. 6 years of training, and I stood in my own kitchen and watched my husband die, and I just stood there. She said it in the flat voice of someone who had said it many times in their own head and had stopped being shocked by it but hadn't stopped being destroyed by it. 40 seconds maybe, 45. That's how long it took me to move. And by then, she didn't finish the sentence. Adrian didn't fill the silence with platitudes. He'd been on the receiving end of enough platitudes to know they were mostly for the speaker's comfort, not the listener's. I know a version of that, he said instead. Not the same, but a version. Mia looked at him. Diana called me the night before she died. I was in San Francisco closing a deal. She said she wasn't feeling well. Headache, nausea, some dizziness. She said she'd been having these headaches for a few weeks, but hadn't told me because she didn't want to worry me. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She asked me to come home early. Just come home. I told her I'd wrap up in the morning and take the first flight back. She said okay. She said she understood. He stopped. She didn't wake up the next morning, he said. The aneurysm ruptured overnight. The housekeeper found her. The cafe moved around them, indifferent and ordinary. Someone's child dropped something plastic on the tile floor, and it made a loud crack, and the child started crying, and the parent soothed it, and the whole small drama resolved itself in 30 seconds, which was how life worked, how it kept going, whether you wanted it to or not. So I know about the 40 seconds, Adrian said. Mine was about 8 hours, and I've spent 3 years running the same calculation you're running. Mia was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not pity, nothing as simple as that. More like recognition. The specific look of someone who sees their own wound reflected and feels, for a second, slightly less alone in having it. It doesn't get smaller, she said quietly. Does it? No, he said. But I think you stop carrying it alone eventually, if you let someone help. She looked away at that, like the idea was too much direct pressure to hold under. I'm not very good at letting people help, she said. I noticed. He said it without edge. I'm not either. She made a short sound, but almost a laugh. 2 broken people at a corner table in Chicago, with excellent coffee at least. This time she actually did laugh. Briefly, just one small burst of it, and it transformed her face, not into something pretty or soft, but into something more like alive. The way a light coming on in a dark house looks like the house itself is waking up. It was gone quickly, but it had been there. Adrian picked up his cup and didn't say what he was thinking, which was that she should do that more. Some things you know better than to say out loud. It became a Saturday thing, and neither of them named it as such, which was how they were both able to keep doing it. Jenna, behind the counter, watched this with the expression of someone who had successfully planted a garden and was now trying very hard to appear as though she hadn't. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian learned the outline of Mia's life. The apartment in Pilsen she'd moved to after Marcus died, chosen because it had no memories and was in a neighborhood she didn't know. The warehouse job she'd taken because it was anonymous and physical and required exactly nothing from her emotionally. The way she spent most evenings alone with takeout and her phone and the television on for noise. The way she woke up at 4 in the morning sometimes because her body still remembered ambulance shift hours. She learned his, the penthouse in the Gold Coast he'd bought when the company went public and had lived in ever since, which had too many rooms and too much glass and felt like living inside an office. The way he worked 70-hour weeks, not because he needed to, but because the alternative was being home with his thoughts. The way he still sometimes set 2 coffee cups out in the morning without thinking. What they shared was the particular architecture of lives that had been dismantled and imperfectly rebuilt around a central absence. They were both still living in the space left by someone who was gone. They were both still, in some fundamental way, waiting for what? Neither could have clearly said. On the 3rd Saturday, Caleb came with Adrian and spent the morning at a corner table doing homework with a focused ferocity that made Mia say, "He's got your jaw," which made Adrian think she'd been looking at him more closely than he'd realized. Caleb finished his math and immediately relocated himself to Mia's side of the table and showed her, on Adrian's phone, 17 photographs of the dinosaur models in his bedroom. Mia looked at all 17 with genuine attention, asked 2 questions that surprised Caleb so much, he repeated them back as statements of fact. "You want to know if I arranged them by time period?" "I arranged them by time period." And Adrian watched his son explaining the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary to a woman who had saved his life 2 weeks ago and felt something he was not ready to call what it was. He called it complicated and moved on. On the drive home, Caleb said from the back seat, in the carrying voice that children deploy when they want to make sure they're heard, "I like Mia." "I know, buddy." "Do you like Mia?" Adrian kept his eyes on the road. "She's a good person." "That's not what I asked." He looked in the rearview mirror at his son, who was looking back at him with an expression of 6-year-old clarity that was, frankly, a little embarrassing. "You're too perceptive for your age," Adrian said. "What's perceptive?" "It means you notice too much." Caleb considered this. "Is that bad?" "No," Adrian said. "It's not bad. It's just a lot, sometimes." Caleb looked out the window, apparently satisfied. Then, "I think she's lonely." Adrian's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "Why do you say that?" "She smiles, but her eyes don't always." He said it simply, the way children say things that are completely true because they haven't learned yet to not say them. "Mom's eyes used to do that too, before she got sick, when she was trying not to worry you." The Chicago streets moved past the window, ordinary and indifferent, and Adrian drove and said nothing for a while, because sometimes 6-year-olds say things that are so accurate and so painful that the only honest response is silence. "You're right," he said eventually. "I think she is lonely." "You should help her," Caleb said. "You're good at that." Adrian didn't answer because he wasn't sure that was true. He wasn't sure he was good at anything except building things that made money and losing people he loved without sufficient warning. But his son said it with such uncomplicated confidence that it stayed with him, lodged somewhere in his chest, the way small, true things do. It was a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after the cafe incident, when things shifted again. He'd been texting with Mia intermittently during the week. Nothing heavy, just the kind of back and forth that develops when two people have established enough shorthand to communicate in fragments. She'd sent him a photograph of a warehouse safety sign with a typo that said "Caution, wet floor." And he'd sent back a picture of a conference room whiteboard where someone had written action items and then listed things that were plainly not action items. Small, stupid things. The kind of text that exists because someone wanted to make another person smile and chose a low-stakes vehicle for it. On Tuesday, she didn't respond to a text he'd sent in the afternoon. He didn't think much about it at first. He was in meetings until 7, came home, put Caleb to bed, checked his phone. Nothing. He told himself she was tired or busy or just not feeling it that night. He woke up at 2 in the morning to a missed call from an unknown number, a voicemail, and 3 text messages from Jenna in quick succession, the first of which was, "Is Mia with you?" He sat up. The voicemail was from a hospital nurse at Rush University Medical Center. Mia had been brought in by a co-worker who'd found her collapsed in the warehouse parking lot at the end of her shift. She was conscious, the nurse said, in a tone calibrated to convey urgency without alarm. She'd listed Jenna's cafe as her emergency contact. Not a person, a cafe, which said something stark about the state of Mia's life that Adrian didn't want to sit with right now. He was in his car and heading to Rush before the voicemail finished. Jenna met him in the lobby, having beaten him there by 10 minutes despite living farther away. She was still in her cafe apron, which meant she'd come directly from closing, her hair loose from whatever it had been pinned in earlier. "They said she's stable," Jenna said immediately. "Collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, some elevated stress markers. She's awake." "Which room?" "They're not letting anyone in yet. She has to agree." Jenna stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Adrian, she listed the cafe as her emergency contact. Not a person. The cafe." He knew. He'd already known it from the voicemail. "I know." "She has no one," Jenna said, and her voice cracked slightly on it, which was not something Jenna's voice did often. "She moved here after Marcus died because she knew no one, and she spent 2 years making sure she stays that way. And I've been trying. I've been calling her. I've been inviting her to things." "Jenna." He covered her hand briefly. "You've done everything right. You always do." She pressed her lips together and nodded, and composed herself in the quick, efficient way she'd learned from their mother. They waited. The ER waiting room was its usual landscape of fluorescent light and managed anxiety. Someone behind a curtain was crying quietly. A child across the room slept across 2 plastic chairs with a coat over them. Adrian sat and looked at his hands and thought about a woman alone in a cold apartment who had set a warehouse address as her emergency contact because she had systematically removed every person from her life. He understood it. That was the terrible part. He understood completely. After Diana died, he'd wanted to do exactly the same thing. Pull everything back, reduce the surface area, make himself impossible to reach so that nothing could reach him. The only thing that had stopped him was Caleb, who needed him every morning, whether he was ready or not. Mia had no one who needed her every morning, so she'd succeeded where he had almost managed. A nurse came out 40 minutes later. Mia had agreed to see them both, the nurse said, with a specific tone that suggested agreed had required some negotiation. She was in a curtained bay on the second floor, attached to an IV drip, wearing a hospital gown that was slightly too large. The lights were dimmed. She looked, if possible, more exhausted than she had the night of their blind date, which had already been a woman running well below empty. When she saw them, she looked immediately embarrassed, which was not the right response to being in a hospital, but it was Mia's response, so it made sense. "You didn't need to come," she said. "You listed a café as your emergency contact," Jenna said, not unkindly. Mia opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the ceiling for a second. "I didn't want to bother anyone," she said finally. "Mia." Jenna pulled a chair up and sat beside the bed. "You collapsed." "It was just exhaustion. The doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said. I'm not talking about the medical part." Jenna leaned forward slightly. "When is the last time you ate a real meal? Not from a vending machine, not standing up over a sink." Mia's silence was its own answer. "When is the last time you called someone just to talk? When is the last time you said yes to an invitation? When is the last time you did anything that wasn't just surviving the day?" Mia looked at her. The embarrassment had shifted into something raw. "Jenna, I'm not angry," Jenna said. "I'm scared for you. There's a difference." Adrian stood at the foot of the bed and said nothing. This was Jenna's conversation, and she was better at it than he would have been. He just stayed, which felt like the most honest thing he could offer. Mia looked at the IV drip for a while. Then, "I don't know how to need things from people anymore. It stopped feeling like something I had permission to do." She said it slowly, like she was figuring it out as she said it. "After Marcus, everyone around me was so kind, and I felt like a burden. Like grief was something I was inflicting on everyone. So I just made it smaller, kept it in the apartment, took it out of everyone else's way." "That's not kindness to yourself," Jenna said quietly. "That's punishment." Mia didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. From the foot of the bed, Adrian said, "Can I show you something tomorrow, if you're released in the morning?" Both women looked at him. "What?" Mia said. "I want to show you something, that's all." He kept his voice level, even. "If you feel up to it." She looked at him with the specific wariness she had around anything that required her to agree to something unknown. "What kind of something?" "The kind you'd have to wait until tomorrow for." A long beat. "That's annoying." "I know." She looked at the ceiling again, then, "Fine." He nodded once and stepped back, and Jenna gave him a look over her shoulder that said, clearly, "What are you doing?" And he gave her a very small shrug back that said he wasn't entirely certain yet, which was the truth. What he showed her was her own apartment. He picked her up from the hospital the next morning. Jenna had sat with her overnight, sleeping in the visitor chair, and drove her back to Pilsen, and when she unlocked the apartment door and walked in ahead of him, he just stood in the doorway for a moment and looked. He'd heard her describe it. Hearing it and seeing it were different things. It was a one-bedroom on the third floor facing west, decent natural light in the afternoon. The bones were fine, but it was the apartment of someone who had never really arrived. A couch she'd clearly had before Marcus died, a coffee table with nothing on it, a kitchen with 2 plates visible through the glass cabinet doors. No photographs anywhere, no color anywhere. The one windowsill had 3 dead plants in pots she hadn't bothered to remove. The bedroom door was open, and the bed was made with the rigid precision of someone for whom making the bed was the only order they could maintain. It looked like a waiting room. Mia turned around and saw him looking, and he watched the defensiveness come up immediately, that particular armor. "I know," she said. It's okay," he said. He wasn't pitying her, he was just standing there, looking at the evidence of a life that had been packed away. "My place looked like this for 8 months after Diana. I slept on the couch for 6 of them. I put everything of hers in storage because I couldn't look at it and I couldn't get rid of it. He stepped inside, hands in his jacket pockets. Eventually, Jenna came over with food and stayed for a week and basically just existed around me until I remembered how to do that too. Mia's arms crossed over her chest. I'm not doing that, he said. I'm not staying for a week. He paused. I just wanted to see it, your actual life, not the version you put out for people. She looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite understanding and wasn't quite resistance. Something uncertain sitting between. It's honest, he said. Your apartment. It's honest about where you actually are. I'm not going to pretend that's not hard to see. He met her eyes. But I've been in harder places than this, and I got out of them, so I'm not afraid of it. She stood there in the middle of her empty apartment, and she looked, for just a moment, the guard all the way down, like someone who was very, very tired of pretending to be okay. I don't know how to not be like this anymore, she said quietly. Her voice had dropped to something private. I don't remember what it felt like to just live in a place like a normal person, have things, care about things. I look around here and I don't. She stopped. I don't feel like I deserve to make it nicer. Does that make sense? Like, Marcus should be here, and he's not. So what right do I have to hang a picture or buy a plant? Or, Mia, his voice was careful. That's not grief anymore. That's punishment. She'd heard Jenna say the same words less than 12 hours ago. Hearing it twice, from two different people, something cracked a little, not completely, just a hairline fracture in the wall. Her eyes went bright and she turned away toward the kitchen, and he let her. He stood in the middle of the empty apartment and waited while she put the kettle on and stood at the counter with her back to him and breathed through whatever was trying to come up. After a while, he sat down on her plain couch and looked at the blank wall across from it and thought about Diana and about Marcus and about the particular terrible mathematics of surviving someone you loved. When Mia came back, she handed him a cup of tea without asking whether he wanted one and sat at the other end of the couch with her own cup, feet tucked under her, and for a while they just sat there without speaking, which was something they'd gotten unexpectedly good at. Tell me about him, Adrian said. She looked at him. Marcus, he said. Tell me something about him, not how he died, something about who he was. The silence that followed was long enough that he thought she might not. Then, he was a terrible driver, she said. Genuinely bad. He'd lived his whole life in Chicago. He'd been driving for 15 years, and he drove like someone who had just learned what a turn signal was and wasn't completely sure how to feel about it. Something shifted in her voice. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, somewhere in the neighborhood of it. I used to grip the door handle every time he got behind the wheel. He thought it was hilarious. Adrian nodded once, kept quiet, held the space open. He was training to become a nurse, she continued, slower now, more careful, like someone testing the ice under each step. That's how we met. I came in for a blood draw. He was doing a practicum. He stuck me 3 times looking for the vein and apologized so many times that I started apologizing back, which made no sense. The thing adjacent to a smile was more present now, fragile but real. He was kind in a way that wasn't showy. That was just what he was. He'd remember things. What you were worried about 3 weeks ago, what you'd mentioned wanting to try. He paid attention. He sounds like someone worth loving, Adrian said quietly. Mia pressed her lips together. Her eyes were wet, but nothing fell. Yeah, she said. He was. She turned the cup in her hands. Outside, the Chicago afternoon was gray and ordinary, the kind of day that doesn't ask anything of anyone. He deserved better than 40 seconds, she said, and her voice went thin on it. Mia. Adrian set his cup down. You were his wife, not his paramedic. When someone you love is dying in front of you, the part of you that loves them is stronger than the part of you that's trained. That's not failure. That's just being human. She looked at him. For a long moment, she just looked at him, like she was deciding whether to accept the thing he was offering or find a reason to give it back. You really believe that, she said. I'm working on it, he said, for both of us. Her breath came out in a long, unsteady exhale that she'd clearly been holding for longer than just this conversation. Her hands were gripping the cup a little too hard. She didn't cry. Not quite, but something in her face changed. Some long-held tension released just enough to be visible, like a window opened a crack in a room that had been sealed for a long time. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't better. It was just one breath after another, which was all any of it ever was, really. They sat in her honest, empty apartment while Chicago went gray outside the windows, and neither of them said anything for a while. And it was the first time in longer than either of them could have said that not saying anything felt like enough. The dead plants went first. Mia threw them out the following morning, pots and all, which was a small thing, and also not a small thing. She stood at the kitchen trash can with all three of them, dried stalks, crumbling dirt, the faint ghost smell of something that had once been alive, and felt the particular guilt of someone who had let things die through inattention rather than intention, which was its own specific category of failure. She threw them out anyway. It didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt like throwing out dead plants. But she stood at the window afterward and looked at the 3 empty circles of condensation left on the sill, and thought, almost involuntarily, that she could put something else there, something with better odds. She didn't do it that day, but she thought it, and thinking it felt like something. She called Jenna that afternoon to say thank you for the hospital night, which Jenna accepted with a characteristic combination of warmth and deflection. "You don't need to thank me, just eat something today, please, actual food." And then, because she was Jenna, she added, "He came to the hospital before I even texted him, you know. He was already in his car." Mia said nothing to that. "Just so you know," Jenna said. "Jenna, I'm just telling you. I know what you're doing." "I'm going to stop now," Jenna said, and didn't sound particularly sincere about it. Mia hung up and stood in her kitchen and looked at the empty windowsill and thought about Adrian Hayes in his too big penthouse setting 2 coffee cups out in the morning without thinking. She thought about the way he'd sat on her couch and asked her to tell him something about Marcus, not how Marcus died, something about who he was, and the particular care of that distinction. She thought about the way it had felt to talk about Marcus to someone who listened without flinching, who didn't immediately try to solve the unsolvable thing, who just stayed. She ordered Thai food from the place 2 blocks over, which she hadn't done in months because it had been Marcus's favorite, and she ate it at the kitchen table instead of standing over the sink. And she didn't turn the television on for noise, just sat with herself in the quiet. It wasn't good, but it was honest, and honest felt like a start. November collapsed into December, the way Chicago Novembers do. Abruptly, brutally, the first real snow arriving on a Thursday night without much warning and staying. The city shifted into its winter posture, people walking faster, heads down, the lake wind doing its worst. Anchor and Elm put out its Christmas decorations, which Jenna did every year with the focused intensity of someone running a military operation, every detail considered. Adrian brought Caleb to the café on the first Saturday of December, and Mia was already there when they arrived. She'd come early, she said. She'd been helping Jenna hang the lights above the windows, which explained the stepladder currently in the corner and the small scrape on her left palm she was pressing a napkin to when they walked in. "You're bleeding," Caleb observed, immediately and with great interest. "Little bit," Mia said. "Staple gun disagreement." "Did the staple gun win?" "This time. I'll get it next time." Caleb nodded, apparently satisfied with this philosophy, and climbed into his usual chair. It had become usual, which Adrian hadn't noticed until he noticed it, and began unwrapping his scarf with the laborious dignity of a person doing something very important. Adrian got their drinks and came back to the table and looked at Mia's hand, which she was still holding the napkin against. "How bad?" "It's not bad." Jenna overreacted. "I didn't overreact," Jenna called from across the cafe without looking up. "You were bleeding on my floor." 1 drop. 2 drops. Mia looked at Adrian. 1 drop. He didn't push it, just settled into his chair and watched his son and this woman who had slowly and without any formal agreement become a fixture in their Saturday mornings, and let himself acknowledge, quietly and without making anything of it, that this was the part of the week he looked forward to most. That the walk from the parking garage to the cafe door had a different quality now than the walk back. That some Sundays he thought about what he might text her, something small and low stakes, just to make that particular thread of connection continue. He hadn't told anyone that, including himself, until just now. He picked up his coffee and changed the direction of his own thoughts, which was a skill he'd gotten considerably better at over the last 3 years, even if it still required effort. Caleb had moved on from his scarf, and was now explaining to Mia the geopolitical dynamics of his second-grade classroom with an intensity normally reserved for congressional testimony. Mia was listening with her chin in her hand, following along, asking pointed questions about the disputed territory of the back row seats. It had been 3 weeks since the hospital, and Mia looked not well exactly, not the kind of well that happens quickly after 2 years of sustained damage, but different. There was slightly more color in her face. She made eye contact more consistently. She'd cut her hair, not dramatically, just enough to look intentional about it, and she was wearing something that wasn't her plain green coat, a dark blue sweater that fit her properly instead of like a thing she'd grabbed without caring. Small things. The accumulation of small things. "Can I ask you something work-related?" she said to Adrian during a brief pause in Caleb's courtroom drama, while Caleb had bent over his hot chocolate with total concentration. "Sure. If someone wanted to go back to a certification they let lapse, EMT, paramedic level, what does that actually take? Do you have to redo everything, or is it more like a recertification process?" Adrian looked at her carefully. He didn't want to make it into more than she was presenting it as. "I don't know offhand, but I know people who would know. I'm just asking theoretically," she said. And she was looking at Caleb, not him, and he could tell it wasn't theoretical at all. "I'll find out," he said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'll find out." She looked at him briefly, that specific look that was somewhere between gratitude and resistance to gratitude, the look of someone who hadn't been helped in so long that being helped felt like a debt. "It's not a debt," he said, quietly enough that Caleb didn't look up. She blinked. "What?" "Whatever you're calculating right now, it's not." A beat. She looked away. "You do that," she said. "Do what?" "Know what I'm thinking." "Sometimes," he said. "Not always. But sometimes the thing you're thinking is on your face." She frowned slightly, which he was realizing was her version of being caught off guard. "I'll work on that." "Don't," he said, and something in how he said it made her go still for just a second before she looked back down at her coffee. Caleb surfaced from his hot chocolate. "Dad, can Mia come to the Christmas dinner?" Both adults looked at him. "Aunt Jenna does the Christmas dinner," Caleb explained to Mia, as if this required context. "At the café. There's a lot of people, and there's turkey, and she makes this bread that—" He pressed his fingers to his mouth in an exaggerated gesture that made Mia smile. "It's the best bread." "The community dinner," Adrian clarified. "Jenna does it every Thanksgiving and Christmas. Open to the neighborhood, regulars, whoever needs a meal. It's a whole thing." Mia was looking at Caleb. "When is it?" "Thanksgiving's in 3 weeks," Adrian said. "If that's not too soon—" "You should come," Caleb said. Simply. Finally. Mia looked at the small boy who had no complexity about wanting her there, who issued the invitation the way children issue things, with total confidence that it would be welcomed because the desire behind it was genuine, and he couldn't yet imagine why that wouldn't be enough. "Yeah," she said after a moment. "Okay." Caleb nodded like this was the correct and obvious answer, and returned to his hot chocolate. Adrian looked at his son and then at Mia and didn't say anything. The weeks between the first Saturday of December and Thanksgiving were the kind of weeks that feel, in retrospect, like the time when things were changing without any single moment you could point to as the change itself. It happened in the accumulation, the texts during the week, the Saturday mornings, the occasional evening when Adrian called instead of texted, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular, or rather about the particular nothings that turn out to matter. What she'd read, what had annoyed him at work, something Caleb had said, something from their separate and very different days that they'd each been turning over and found themselves wanting to share. He had her recertification information within 3 days of her asking. He sent it in a text, just a bullet list of requirements, no commentary attached, and she replied after 15 minutes with, "This is more achievable than I thought." He didn't say anything back for a while, let it sit. Then, "Yeah?" A long pause. Then, "Maybe." He didn't push. He'd learned not to push. Maybe was enormous, coming from her. 3 days before Thanksgiving, something happened that he didn't hear about until after the fact. And when he heard about it, he sat with it for a long time. Mia had been at her local pharmacy picking up a prescription. She was on a short course of iron supplements after the hospital. Her levels had been low, when a woman in the next aisle dropped a bag and bent to pick it up and made a sound that wasn't quite normal. Mia had been the only other person in the aisle. The woman was 60-something, and the sound she'd made was involuntary, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere in the chest. Mia had stopped. She'd said, later, to Adrian, that the whole thing happened in the space of about 4 seconds inside her head, which was not much time for the volume of material that had moved through it. Marcus in the kitchen, her feet refusing to work, the gap between knowing what to do and doing it. The feeling of those 40 seconds, actually 43, she'd counted them in her nightmares more times than she could say, sitting in her body like something permanently embedded. She'd stopped. She'd felt it, the pull of it, the freeze trying to start. And then she'd crossed the aisle and asked the woman if she was okay. The woman was okay. She'd bent down too fast and gotten dizzy, nothing more. She'd stood up slowly with Mia's hand steady on her arm and said she was fine, thank you, and had gone about her shopping, and the whole incident lasted approximately 90 seconds. Mia had stood in the pharmacy aisle afterward for about a full minute doing nothing in particular. Then she'd bought her iron supplements and gone home. She told Adrian about it that night, on the phone, in the offhand way she had of presenting significant things as though they were minor. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "How did it feel?" "Terrifying," she said immediately, right up until it wasn't. "What made it not terrifying?" A pause. "She needed me to move," Mia said. "So I moved." He didn't point out that this was exactly what she hadn't been able to do for 2 years. He didn't make it a milestone or a victory or anything that would make her feel like she was being observed. He just said, "Good," and meant it in the plain way of someone who had just watched a real thing happen. "It's not the same," she said quickly. "It's not. She just got dizzy. It was nothing. It's not like an emergency." "Mia, you moved when someone needed you. That's what matters." Silence on the line. He could hear her breathing. "I'm looking at paramedic recertification programs," she said very quietly, like she was saying it out loud for the first time and testing how it felt. "There's one at Northwestern, 12 weeks. I've been looking at it for a week." "I know," he said. "How do you know?" "I don't. I just figured." She made a sound that was half exasperated and half something warmer. "You're annoying." "I know. I haven't applied. I'm just looking at it." "Okay." "Don't make it into a thing." "I'm not making it into anything." "You're doing that thing where you're supportive without saying anything, and it's somehow worse." He almost smiled. "Would you prefer I say something?" "No." A beat. "Maybe." Another beat. "I don't know. For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're going to do it. I think you've been deciding for weeks, and you just haven't let yourself know yet." The pause that followed was long. "I should go," she said finally. "Yeah." "Good night, Adrian." "Good night, Mia." She hung up, and he sat in his quiet penthouse and listened to the city outside and thought about momentum, how it builds invisibly, how it exists before you're aware of it, how by the time you see it, it's already been going for a while. Chaste. Thanksgiving at Anchor and Elm was, as Caleb had promised and then some, a whole thing. Jenna had been running this dinner for 6 years, every Thanksgiving and Christmas, building it from a small neighborly gesture into something that regularly drew 40 to 60 people. The cafe was strung with warm lights, and the tables were pushed together into long communal rows. Jenna and her 2 part-time staff had been cooking since 5 in the morning. The smell hit the street. Roasted turkey and sage stuffing and the specific warm bread smell that Caleb had tried to describe with hand gestures 3 weeks ago and had, Mia now understood, not been exaggerating about. Mia arrived at noon and stopped just inside the door for a second because she hadn't been in a room this full or this warm in a long time, and the full sensory impact of it was momentarily overwhelming. Not bad, just a lot, when you'd been living in quiet and empty for 2 years. Jenna appeared from the kitchen, apron on, flour on her forearm, and grabbed Mia's coat and said, "You're on bread duty," which was the most Jenna way imaginable to make someone feel immediately necessary, and Mia found herself in the cafe kitchen learning the proper way to slice Jenna's honey rosemary loaves before she'd even fully processed that she was there. Adrian arrived at 12:30 with Caleb, who was wearing a tiny button-down shirt that he'd clearly dressed himself in because it was slightly too small and one button was missed, creating a gap at his midsection. Adrian had apparently chosen not to correct this, or had tried and lost, which was plausible. When Caleb saw Mia, he crossed the cafe at speed and said, "You're here," with the uncomplicated relief of someone who had genuinely not been sure. "I said I'd come," Mia said. "I know," Caleb said, "but sometimes people say that." Mia looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "You're right, they do." She crouched down. "But I'm here." He seemed satisfied. He immediately took her hand and pulled her toward the bread she'd been cutting and told her she was doing it wrong, which she had been. And they had a brief and serious discussion about the correct thickness of bread slices before Jenna intervened with actual authority. Adrian watched this from across the room with his jacket still on and a cup of coffee in his hand, and felt something warm move through him that he'd stopped arguing with weeks ago. He'd stopped trying to name it too, because naming it felt like putting it inside a container, and he wasn't ready to see whether it fit. By 2 in the afternoon, the cafe was full. People Adrian knew from Jenna's regulars, people he didn't know. An elderly man named Frank who came every year and always sat at the same corner table and always cried a little after the toast and always denied it afterward. A family with 3 small children who commandeered a table near the window with maximum chaos and minimum apology. 2 women who appeared to be on a first date and were therefore simultaneously the most and least relaxed people in the room. Mia moved through it more easily than Adrian expected. She wasn't social in the performed way, wasn't working the room, wasn't finding it effortless. He could see it wasn't effortless, could see the moments when the noise and the closeness pushed against whatever internal volume limit she had. But she stayed. She talked to people when they talked to her. She helped clear plates without being asked. She sat next to Caleb during the meal and helped him identify all the dishes on the table and patiently explained what stuffing was when Caleb claimed, with great conviction, that he had never in his life seen stuffing before, which was not accurate. Adrian sat across from her and watched his son lean against her arm while she explained the cultural history of cranberry sauce, which she was also slightly making up, and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was what he'd been missing. Not just companionship in the abstract, specifically this, someone at the table who was real about things, who didn't perform happiness or ease but actually worked toward them, in front of him, imperfectly and without apology. Diana had been that. He'd loved her for 12 years, and she'd been that, the realest person in every room. And losing her had made him believe, not consciously, not in a way he could have articulated before now, that the particular realness she'd had was a thing that happened only once. He looked at Mia across the table. He thought he'd been wrong about that. Then Jenna stood up and said, "Okay, I'm doing the toast, and it's going to be embarrassing for some of you," which was her standard opener, and the room laughed and Adrian let the moment pass before he did something inadvisable with it. The man started choking at 20 minutes past 2. Mia heard it before she registered what it was, that specific, awful silence in the middle of sound, the involuntary quality of it. She turned. 3 tables away, an older man, 70s maybe, was on his feet with one hand pressed to his throat and the other gripping the table's edge. His face was going red. His wife beside him was up immediately, hand on his back, looking around the room with the specific panicked look of someone desperately trying to find a person who knows what to do. The room caught up with itself in about 2 seconds. The noise dropped. Someone gasped. Jenna, from behind the counter, said, "Does anyone?" And the rest of the sentence got lost. Mia stood up. And then she stopped. It was involuntary. She didn't decide to stop. Her body just stopped. One hand on the table's edge, and everything hit at once. Not the pharmacy aisle this time. Not a slow dizziness. This was a man not breathing. This was the sound of real emergency filling a room. This was her hands going cold and the table going solid under her grip, and Marcus in the kitchen on the floor, Marcus's face, the 43 seconds she had burned into her somewhere permanent and unreachable. She stood there, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The room was moving around her. Someone else starting to stand, uncertain, someone saying call 911, the man's wife saying his name now over and over, Ray, Ray, Ray. And then Adrian was beside her, not in front of her, not in her way, just beside her, close enough that his arm was against hers, and he said quietly, in the particular register he used when he was being as honest as he knew how to be, "You don't have to face this alone anymore." 7 words. Not a pep talk, not a push, just a statement of fact. The freeze cracked. Mia moved. She crossed the 3 tables in seconds, got behind the man, Ray, his name was Ray, got her arms around him, positioned her hands, felt for the right place, and drove upward. Once. The dislodged piece of food flew forward. Ray lurched and coughed and grabbed the table and pulled in a massive, ragged breath that everyone in the room seemed to breathe with him. His wife made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She had her hands on his face, and he was nodding, breathing, his color beginning to come back. And he said, in a wrecked, grateful voice, "I'm okay. I'm okay, Loretta. I'm okay." The room exhaled. Someone started clapping, then several people, then the whole table going, and Mia stood there with her arms dropped to her sides and realized her hands were shaking, not from exertion, from the inside, from the adrenaline and the fear and the thing that had tried to stop her and hadn't this time quite succeeded. She turned and walked straight toward the back of the cafe, past the kitchen, out the side door that opened into the alley behind the building. The cold hit her immediately, a genuine Chicago November cold, the kind that finds gaps in your clothes and gets personal. She was still in her sweater. She pressed her back against the brick wall of the alley, and her legs were unreliable, and she slid down until she was sitting on the cold concrete with her knees up and her hands shaking and her face doing things she couldn't currently manage. She was crying. She hadn't fully realized it until she was already doing it. Not quiet, graceful crying, but the ugly, racking kind. The kind that comes from a place that's been sealed for a long time. Her shoulders were shaking. Her breath kept hitching and catching, and she pushed her hands against her face, trying to get control of it, and couldn't. She'd moved. She'd been frozen, and she'd moved. She'd been terrified, and she'd done it anyway. And Ray was inside breathing, and his wife was holding his face, and Mia Carter was in a cold alley behind a cafe on Thanksgiving, crying so hard she couldn't see. And she didn't fully know why, except that it was everything at once. Marcus and the kitchen, and 43 seconds and 2 years of carrying it alone, and the fact that she'd moved, finally moved, and it hadn't been clean or brave or easy. It had been 3 seconds of freezing first, and a man saying 7 words, and then somehow doing it anyway. The side door opened. Adrian sat down beside her on the cold concrete without hesitation, without asking whether she wanted him to, without producing any particular thing to say. He sat down, and he was just there, shoulder against shoulder in the November cold, and he let her fall apart without trying to catch her, or stop her, or tell her it was okay. He didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't okay. It was a long time before it would be okay, but it was happening, the thing she'd been not doing for 2 years. The thing she'd been so afraid of, she'd moved to an empty apartment and changed careers and stopped calling people back. She was letting it happen, and she wasn't alone while it did. She cried for a while, not forever. It crested and slowly, unevenly, came back down, the way these things do. When she could breathe again, she dropped her hands into her lap and looked at the opposite wall of the alley, wet brick and a painted-over mural and a dumpster and the very unglamorous reality of a back alley behind a cafe. "I froze," she said. Her voice was rough. "For 3 seconds, I froze." "And then you moved," Adrian said. 3 seconds. "And then you moved," he said again, quiet and even. "That's what happened." She pressed the back of her hand to her face. "I thought about Marcus. Right at the start. I thought about the kitchen. I know. It was like the door trying to close. All of it just trying to close again. But it didn't." She exhaled, long, unsteady, real. "No, it didn't." She turned her head to look at him, and he was looking at her steadily. No performance of strength, just present. "What you said. You don't have to face this alone anymore." "Yeah." She held his gaze. "How did you know that was the right thing?" He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know," he said. I saw you stop, and I knew it wasn't because you didn't know what to do. It was because you thought you had to do it the same way you've been doing everything for 2 years." He paused. Alone. The alley was very cold and very quiet. From inside the cafe, muffled by brick and glass, She could hear the sound of the room recovering, voices, the specific released energy of a crisis past, someone laughing, the ordinary music of people resuming the business of being alive. "I was a good paramedic," she said, and for the first time in a long time, she said it without the past tense carrying a verdict. "I know," Adrian said. "I might want to be one again." "I know that too." She looked at the opposite wall. Her hands had stopped shaking. The cold was seeping through her sweater, and she hadn't brought her coat, and she was sitting on a concrete alley floor and didn't much want to move yet. Beside her, Adrian shrugged off his jacket and held it out without comment. She looked at it, then at him. "You're going to freeze," she said. "I run warm," he said, which was probably a lie. She took the jacket, pulled it around her shoulders. It smelled like his cologne and the cafe's cinnamon, and underneath both of those, something just human and warm, and she pulled it tighter and sat with it for a moment without saying anything. "Thank you," she said. Not about the jacket. "You did the work," he said. "I just showed up." "Showing up," Mia said quietly, "is more than most people do." The side door opened again and Caleb's face appeared in the gap, round and serious, and immediately relieved when he saw them both. "Jenna said to tell you that Ray is okay and his wife wants to meet Mia," he said, with the solemn accuracy of a message faithfully delivered. "Okay," Mia said. "Tell her I'll be in a minute." Caleb didn't leave. He stepped outside and let the door close behind him and sat down on Mia's other side, in the cold, without being asked or invited, with the complete naturalness of someone who had decided that wherever these two people were was where he was going to be. He had a paper napkin in his hand, folded once, and he held it out to Mia. She took it, looked at it. He'd drawn on it. A crayon wasn't at hand, so he'd used a marker borrowed from somewhere. A large lopsided heart, filled in red, with her name written inside it in the uneven, large-lettered print of a second grader. "Caleb," Adrian said. "I made it inside," Caleb said. "While everyone was clapping, I wanted her to have it." He looked at Mia with the direct eyes of a child who loves without strategy. "You were scared, and you still did it. That's what brave is. My dad told me that." Mia looked at the napkin heart for a long moment. Then she cried again, but different this time. The kind of tears that aren't about loss, the kind that are about something coming back, some small and essential thing returning to a place that had been empty, flooding back in with the warmth you'd forgotten was possible. She pressed the napkin to her face and laughed once, broken and real, and put her arm around Caleb and pulled him against her side, and he went without resistance, burrowing into her as though he'd done it before, as though this was a thing that had always been true. Adrian sat on her other side in the cold without his jacket and said nothing, and didn't need to. Later, Loretta, Ray's wife, held Mia's hands in both of hers and said, in a voice that was still unsteady at the edges, "You came back to yourself just in time, sweetheart." She didn't know how precisely true that was. She meant it medically. She had no idea she'd also just described the last 2 months of Mia Carter's life. Mia squeezed her hands back and said, "He's going to be fine." "Because of you," Loretta said. Mia looked across the cafe to where Adrian was helping Caleb with the second round of dessert, and where Jenna was watching her from behind the counter with that particular expression she had when something went the way she'd hoped. And she thought about a cold November night and a blind date she hadn't wanted, and a small boy's blue mitten held out in the air outside a hospital. And she thought about 43 seconds in a kitchen 2 years ago and 3 seconds in a cafe today. She thought about the distance between those two silences. "Yeah," she said, and left it there at that one word, because some things don't need to be explained to be true. The napkin heart was on her refrigerator by the following morning. Mia had put it there with a piece of tape, slightly crooked, the red marker heart already smearing a little at the edges from being held too tightly in a cold alley. It was the first thing on her refrigerator in 2 years, the first thing on any surface in her apartment that meant something, that she'd put there deliberately rather than just failing to remove. She stood in front of it for a while on Friday morning with her coffee going cold in her hand. The Northwestern Paramedic Recertification Program had an application deadline in 3 weeks. She'd been looking at the same page for 10 days. She knew the requirements the way you know something you've read so many times it stops looking like words. National Registry lapse procedure, clinical hours needed, written examination, skills verification. She could recite it. She just hadn't filled out the form. She pulled up the application on her laptop at the kitchen table and sat with it, the way you sit with something you're afraid of. The cursor blinking in the first field. Full legal name. The most basic possible entry point, and still she sat there for a full minute before she started typing. Mia Ann Carter. She typed her name and then kept going slowly, one field at a time, the way you walk across ice, testing each step, not committing your full weight until you're sure it'll hold. Previous certifications. Employment history. She got to the section that asked for a statement of purpose. Why are you returning to emergency medicine? And stopped. She sat there for a long time. Then she typed, because someone needed me to move, and I did. And I want to be the person who does that again. She read it back. It was not eloquent. It was not the kind of thing that sounded impressive on an application. She submitted it anyway. Her hands were shaking when she closed the laptop. Not bad shaking, the kind that happens when your body is processing something your brain decided before it had time to second-guess it. She pressed both palms flat on the kitchen table and breathed and looked at Caleb's napkin heart on the refrigerator and thought, okay. She didn't text Adrian. She wanted to. She noticed that she wanted to, which was its own kind of information, but she held on to it for a day. It felt like something she needed to own by herself first, just for a little while before she handed any part of it to someone else. She called Jenna instead, which was easier and harder in different ways. Jenna answered on the second ring, and when Mia told her she'd applied, Jenna went so quiet that Mia thought the call had dropped. Jenna, I'm here. A pause. Then with a steadiness that was clearly covering something less steady. I'm really glad. Don't make it into a thing, Mia said. I just applied. I might not even get in. You'll get in, Jenna said. That's not the thing. The thing is you applied. Mia looked at the refrigerator. Yeah, she said. That's the thing. She told Adrian that evening. She texted because calling still felt like too much exposure for something this new, applied to the Northwestern program. 3 minutes later, her phone rang. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then she picked up. You didn't have to call, she said. I know. His voice was unhurried. How do you feel? Terrified? That's right. That's not reassuring. Wasn't trying to reassure you. Terrified means it matters. Things that don't matter aren't terrifying. A beat. I was terrified when I started the company. Couldn't sleep for 3 months. And now? Now I'm terrified about different things. She could hear something in his voice, not quite amusement, something quieter. It doesn't go away. You just get better at operating while it's happening. She was quiet for a moment. Marcus would have said something obnoxious and optimistic right now, she said. He was one of those people. What would he have said? She thought about it. Probably something like, Babe, you've been keeping people alive since you were 24. Why would you stop? She said it in a slightly different voice, slightly lighter than her own, the faint muscle memory echo of someone else's cadence. He was annoyingly correct about most things. Sounds like he was. He would have liked you, she said, and it came out before she'd considered it, and once it was out, she didn't try to take it back because it was true, and true things shouldn't be taken back. He would have said you were too intense, but he would have meant it as a compliment. A pause. Diana would have liked you too, Adrian said. She had no patience for people who weren't real. She would have found you in about 4 minutes and decided you were worth keeping around. The silence between them was warm in a way silence between them hadn't always been. We're talking about our dead spouses, Mia said. Yeah. Is that weird? I think it's the opposite of weird, he said. I think it's the most honest conversation I've had in a long time. She sat with that. Outside her window, the city was doing what December cities do. Lights and cold and the particular compressed energy of people trying to get somewhere. The dead plants were gone from the sill. She'd bought one new one, a small pothos from the grocery store. Nothing significant, just something alive. Good night, Adrian, she said. Good night, Mia. She held the phone for a moment after the call ended, just held it, and the feeling in her chest was complicated and warm and slightly frightening, and she let all three of those things be true simultaneously instead of trying to resolve them into something simpler. December moved through its paces. The cold deepened. Caleb had his second-grade holiday concert, in which he played a recorder with the aggressive confidence of someone who had practiced significantly less than required. And Mia went because Caleb had asked her directly, looking up at her with eyes that made it impossible to say no, and she sat in the school auditorium between Adrian and Jenna and clapped harder than anyone when the second grade came on. Caleb found her immediately afterward in the lobby, still clutching his recorder, and said, "Did you hear the part where I did the high note?" "I heard all the notes," Mia said truthfully. He beamed. Adrian caught her eye over Caleb's head and said nothing, which was sometimes how he communicated most clearly. After, they went to the pizza place 2 blocks from the school that Caleb declared the best pizza in Chicago, which was a large claim for a 6-year-old, but he made it with conviction. They sat in a booth, Caleb between them, which he'd arranged himself by the simple method of sitting in the middle and looking at them both expectantly until they filled in the sides, and ate pizza and talked about everything and nothing. The recorder concert. Whether pineapple was legitimate on pizza, which Caleb argued yes and Mia argued no, and Adrian stayed diplomatically neutral, which Caleb called cowardly, which made Mia laugh. The fact that Caleb had been assigned a biography report and had chosen to do it on a paleontologist instead of the expected historical figures, which his teacher had apparently accepted with tired resignation. It was an ordinary evening, a pizza place, a child with recorder-related pride, a booth on a cold December night. It was the best evening Adrian had had in 3 years, and he was aware of that. And he didn't say it, because saying it felt like adding weight to something that was currently working precisely because it was being allowed to be light. But he knew. On the drive home, Caleb fell asleep in the back seat before they'd gone 4 blocks. The deep, sudden sleep of a child who had performed at full capacity and used everything up. Mia was in the passenger seat. Adrian drove, and the city moved past the windows, and they didn't talk for a while, which was fine. "Can I ask you something?" Mia said, when they were about halfway to her apartment. "Sure." "Do you think about the future? Like, actually think about it, not the company stuff?" He considered the question properly before answering. "I used to not be able to," he said. "After Diana, the future felt like a place I wasn't supposed to go, like it belonged to someone else's life." He paused. "Lately it's different." She was looking out the passenger window. "Different how?" "It feels like somewhere that might actually exist, that I might actually be in." A beat. "Does that make sense?" "More than you'd think," she said quietly. He didn't push it further. They arrived at her building, and he pulled up to the curb, and she gathered her coat and her bag and then sat there a moment instead of getting out, looking at her hands. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Her voice was low and careful, the way she got when she was saying something she'd been holding for a while. He didn't ask her to clarify. He knew what this was. "Neither do I," he said. "Not anymore. Not after—" He stopped. "Not after losing someone. You forget how the whole thing works. Or maybe it just works differently the second time." She looked at him. In the dim light of the car, the city behind her through the glass, she looked the way she'd looked that first night in the cafe. Tired, real, not performing anything. But something else now, too, something that hadn't been there a month and a half ago. Something that looked like someone who had started, very tentatively, to be present in their own life again. "I'm scared," she said. "So am I." "Of what, specifically?" she said, and it wasn't a challenge, just a real question. He thought about it honestly. "Of caring about someone and then losing them again," he said. "Of letting Caleb get attached and having it go wrong, of building something and then watching it." He stopped. "Of the specific way you already know how bad it can get." She nodded slowly. "Same?" she said. "Almost exactly the same." "So we're 2 scared people, in a car outside my apartment at 10:30 on a Tuesday." "Yeah?" She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I don't know where this goes. I genuinely don't. I'm not—" She pressed her lips together. "I'm not in a place where I can promise anyone anything. I'm still—" She gestured vaguely at herself, meaning all of it. The recertification and the empty apartment and the napkin heart on the refrigerator and the 43 seconds she'd never fully stopped carrying. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for promises." "Then what are you asking for?" He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm just still here. That's all." She held his gaze for a moment that went slightly longer than a neutral moment. Then she got out of the car, closed the door, and walked to her building entrance. At the door, she turned around and looked back at him, and in the cold December air she said, clearly enough that he could read it through the glass, Good night. He watched her go inside, sat there for a second with his hands on the wheel. From the back seat came the deep unconscious breathing of his sleeping son. He drove home and didn't try to solve anything, and let it be what it was. The acceptance letter from Northwestern arrived the second week of December in his email at 9 on a Wednesday morning. Not his email, Mia's. She forwarded it to him without comment except a single line at the top. They said yes. He replied, "I know." She replied, "Stop doing that." He smiled at his phone in the middle of a board meeting and put it face down. The program started in January. 12 weeks? 3 evenings a week plus alternating Saturdays. Clinical rotations beginning week 6. Skills verification in week 10. Written examination at the end. It was not easy. It was not designed to be easy. The recertification process for a lapsed paramedic was structured on the assumption that things had to be relearned in the right order, carefully, with supervision, because people's lives would eventually depend on it. Mia spent the 2 weeks before the start date studying. She'd gone to the bookstore, an actual bookstore, which she hadn't been inside in months, and bought the current editions of the textbooks she needed, and she read them at her kitchen table in the evenings. The apartment a little warmer now, a string of cheap lights on the windowsill she'd bought on impulse at a drugstore. The pothos still alive and now accompanied by a second plant, a small jade that the woman at the checkout had told her was basically indestructible. The dead plants zone had been reclaimed. She'd also put a photograph on the small shelf by the door, Marcus and her, from a camping trip the year before he died, both of them sunburned and laughing at something the camera couldn't explain. It had been in a box since she moved. She'd stood in front of the shelf for a long time before she put it up, but she put it up. She told Adrian about the photograph one evening on the phone. There was a pause before he said, That's good, Mia." "It hurt," she said, "putting it there." "I know. But it felt wrong that it was in a box, like I was," she searched for the word, "like I was pretending he didn't exist because it was easier." "You were surviving," he said, "and now you're doing something different." "I don't know if I'm doing it right." "There's no right," he said. "Diana's stuff sat in storage for 18 months before I could deal with it. I still have her coffee mug in the cabinet. I use it sometimes, not on purpose. I just reach for it." He paused. "The grief counselor I saw the first year told me there's no timeline. I kept waiting for the timeline." "You saw a grief counselor? For about 8 months?" He was decent. A little too fond of the phrase moving forward, but otherwise useful. Mia was quiet a moment. "I never talked to anyone," she said. "After Marcus, I just went to work and then stopped going to work, and then moved and just," she exhaled, "managed it alone." "I know." "That was probably bad." "Probably," he said, with a gentleness that took the edge off the honesty. "But you're talking now. That counts." She didn't answer immediately. Then, "I'm talking to you." "Yeah," he said. "That's different from a therapist." "Very different," he agreed. She could hear the smile in it and felt the echo of one on her own face, small and real. "Don't be smug about it." "I'm not being smug." "You're being a little smug." "Marginally," he admitted. "It's the occasion." She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window, looking out at the Chicago night, the lights and the cold, and all those people down there getting on with the business of being alive, and thought that she was, for the first time in a long time, starting to feel like she was one of them again. Not all the way. Not cleanly, but the direction had changed. That was enough for now. Christmas Eve landed on a Saturday, which meant Anchor and Elm in its fullest possible version. Jenna had outdone herself. The cafe draped in lights so thick and warm that stepping inside felt like stepping into the inside of something alive. The Christmas dinner crowd was even larger than Thanksgiving. Some familiar faces, many new ones. The city doing its thing of showing who its people actually were when the year got hard at the end. Mia arrived early again. She was getting into the habit of that. Arriving early, which was a departure from the person who, 6 weeks ago, had walked through that same door looking for the fastest possible exit. She helped Jenna arrange tables and then found herself next to an older woman named Ruth Ann, who turned out to have 30 years of nursing behind her and strong opinions about cardiopulmonary assessment technique, And they talked for 45 minutes about emergency medicine with the specific pleasure of two people who had found an unexpected match. When Adrian arrived with Caleb, who was wearing a red sweater with a slightly misaligned collar that Adrian had not been permitted to fix, he found Mia deep in conversation, hands moving as she explained something technical, her face lit in a way that he'd seen beginning to appear more frequently, the alive quality, the one that turned on when she was fully inside something she cared about. He didn't interrupt. He got Caleb settled and got their drinks and sat and watched her from across the room and felt the particular warmth of seeing someone you care about be fully themselves. Caleb noticed where he was looking because Caleb always noticed. "She looks happy," he said. "She does," Adrian agreed. "That's because she's coming back," Caleb said, with the certainty of someone who had decided this was true and found no reason to qualify it. Adrian looked at his son. "What do you mean, coming back?" "She went away," Caleb said simply. "Not far. She was still here, but she went away on the inside, and now she's coming back." He picked up his hot chocolate, today made by Jenna with careful documented allergen verification and a note taped to the cup reading "safe," because Jenna was Jenna, and drank it with the equanimity of someone who had said the complete and correct thing and saw no need to add to it. Adrian sat with that. When Mia joined them, she was flushed from the warmth in the conversation, and she sat down and said immediately, "There's a woman here who was a trauma nurse for 30 years, and she completely disagrees with the current assessment protocol recommendations, and she's almost certainly right," which was the most animated Adrian had heard her about anything work-related, and it sat in his chest like a warm thing. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not all of it was territory he had the background to fully follow, but he followed what he could and asked questions that she answered with the focused pleasure of someone who had missed having expertise and was finding their way back to it. Caleb interjected twice with questions that were earnest and completely off topic, and each time Mia answered them seriously, and then found her way back without missing a beat. It was the kind of evening that doesn't know it's significant while it's happening. The cafe full and warm, the snow starting outside the windows around 8 o'clock, real snow. The slow and serious kind. Jenna's bread appearing from the kitchen in waves. Frank in the corner crying after the toast and denying it with his usual vigor. Caleb falling asleep at the table sometime after 9 with his head pillowed on his crossed arms. The Bears hat still firmly in place. Around 10, when the crowd had thinned to the late stayers, Mia and Adrian were sitting with their third round of coffee. Decaf at this point, in deference to sleeping hours. And the conversation had gone quiet in the easy way it did now. Outside, the snow was coming down steadily, blurring the city into something softer. "Can I show you something?" Adrian said. She looked at him. "Not a building I own or a view from a penthouse or anything like that," she said preemptively. "No," he said mildly. "Worse." He took his phone out and turned it toward her. On the screen was a photograph, taken on a disposable camera by the slightly washed-out quality of it, the kind of photograph that had been digitized from physical film. It showed a woman in a kitchen, laughing, with flour on her face and what was clearly a burned pan in her hand, wholly unbothered, dark hair loose around her shoulders. The kitchen had cinnamon candles on the windowsill. Mia looked at it. "Diana," she said. "Yeah, every Sunday morning." He looked at the photograph. "I kept it on my phone because it was the most her I ever captured her. Not a posed thing, just her, burning pancakes and finding it funny." Mia studied the image for a moment. The woman in the photograph was beautiful in a very particular living way. Not the polished beautiful of official photographs, but the specific beautiful of someone completely comfortable inside their own life. "She looks like someone who never needed to be anywhere else," Mia said quietly. "She didn't. She was entirely herself wherever she was." He paused. "I've never showed that photo to anyone. I don't know why I'm showing it to you." She looked at him. The cafe was quiet around them, just a few tables occupied, Jenna moving behind the counter, Caleb asleep beside them with the absolute totality of a child who had decided sleep was happening and made it non-negotiable. "Because I'm safe," Mia said. It wasn't a question. "That's why." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's why." She handed the phone back. For a moment their hands overlapped on it, just briefly, and neither of them moved to resolve that immediately. Then she sat back and he set the phone down, and they were quiet. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me say the whole thing before you respond." "Okay?" She looked at the table, then at him. "I came here 6 weeks ago for a blind date I didn't want, and I sat down across from you and thought, I just need to get through this and go home. And then your son stopped breathing, and everything—" She stopped, found the thread again. "Everything shifted, and I've been trying to figure out for 6 weeks what's actually happening here, between us." He waited. "The thing is," she said, I'm still not fixed. I'm not the person I was before Marcus. I'm not going to be that person again. I'm a different one, and I'm still figuring out who she is." She looked at him steadily. "And you're someone who has a son who already calls me brave and draws me hearts on napkins, which is—" her voice caught very slightly, "which is not a small thing. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand. So I need you to know that I can't walk into this like nothing could go wrong. I can't be casual about it. I'm not built for casual about it." "Neither am I," he said. "I know." She took a breath. "So I just wanted to say—" She stopped, started again. "I wanted to say that I'm glad it was you, that night, across the table. I'm glad it was specifically you." The snow was coming down outside the cafe windows. Caleb breathed his steady, child-sleep breath beside them. The last of Jenna's regulars were putting their coats on. Adrian looked at Mia Carter, who had walked through this cafe door 6 weeks ago, looking for the exit, and had instead saved his son's life, and let him sit on her floor and put a photograph back on her shelf, and applied to recertification programs, and held a small blue mitten in a hospital parking lot outside in November, and who was sitting across from him now, being more honest than most people managed in years. "I'm glad it was you too," he said. She let out a small, careful breath, like she'd been holding it at low pressure for a while. "Okay," she said. "That's all I was going to say." "Okay," he said. Jenna appeared from the kitchen with a small plate of cookies she set between them without comment, looked at both of them, looked at the ceiling in the expression of someone exercising enormous restraint, and went back to the kitchen. Mia picked up a cookie. "She's never going to let us forget she set this up." "Never," Adrian agreed. "I can hear you," Jenna called from the kitchen. Caleb chose this moment to surface from sleep just enough to say, without opening his eyes, "I knew you'd figure it out," before sinking back down with complete finality. Mia looked at the small boy asleep beside her. Something moved across her face that was not anything she tried to manage or contain, just something real, moving through her freely. She reached over and very gently straightened his bear's hat, which had gone sideways. It was a small gesture, the kind that doesn't mean everything and also means everything depending on where you're standing. Adrian watched it happen and felt, somewhere very deep and very specific, the particular feeling of ice finally, slowly giving way. Not gone, not resolved, not the clean beginning of something uncomplicated, just the slow yielding of something that had been frozen for a long time, beginning, at last, to move. January came the way Chicago Januaries always do, without apology, without warning that it would be worse than you remembered. The cold settling into the city like something that had always lived there and was simply reminding everyone of that fact. The lake froze at the edges. The streets narrowed under snow that the plows pushed into gray walls along the curbs. People walked with their chins tucked and their hands jammed deep, and the collective expression of a city that had made its peace with winter but wasn't happy about it. Mia started the Northwestern program on a Tuesday evening in the second week of January. She drove herself. She'd thought about it, considered whether to tell Adrian, considered the shape of arriving at something this significant alone versus arriving at it with someone. She decided alone, for the same reason she'd held the application to herself for one day before telling anyone, because some things you need to own completely before you share them. Because if you let other people's belief in you carry too much weight at the start, you risk not knowing whether you're doing it for yourself or for them. She wore her old uniform pants, the ones she'd kept in the back of her closet for 2 years still in the dry cleaning bag, because she wanted to feel the weight of the things she was returning to. They still fit. She'd stood in her bedroom looking at herself in the mirror before leaving, and the woman looking back at her was not the 24-year-old who'd first put on the EMT uniform, was not the 30-year-old who'd taken it off the last time, was someone else, older, more damaged, more careful about things, with a scar near her eyebrow and a photograph of her dead husband by the door and a napkin heart on the refrigerator. She nodded at the mirror, which was not a thing she'd done before or would probably do again, but felt right in that moment, and drove to Northwestern. The classroom had 12 students in the recertification cohort. She was the oldest by 2 years. The instructor was a woman named Carla Reyes, who was 52 and had been a paramedic and then a paramedic trainer for 20 years, and who had the particular no patience for nonsense manner of someone who knew exactly how much was at stake in this room. In the first 15 minutes, she said, "Recertification is not remediation. You knew how to do this. We're here to make sure your body remembers what your brain already knows and to update everything that's changed since you were last in the field. If you're waiting for me to be gentle about this, I'd adjust those expectations now." Mia liked her immediately. The first class was classroom work, protocol updates, pharmacology changes, regulatory review. Nothing hands-on yet. It was a lot of sitting and listening and taking notes, and Mia sat in the second row and wrote things down in a spiral notebook she'd bought specifically for this and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like she was pointed in a direction that made sense. It wasn't triumphant. She was tired by the end of it, and nervous in a way that had less to do with the material and more to do with the creeping awareness that in 6 weeks she'd be doing clinical rotations and people would be depending on her actual competence, not her historical competence. The gap between knowing something and doing it under pressure was a gap she understood very precisely and very personally. She texted Adrian from the parking lot afterward. Day 1. Still standing. He replied within 2 minutes. How was it? She thought about it, like remembering a language I thought I'd forgotten. The words are there, the grammar is still there. Rusty, but there. A pause. Then, that's everything. She sat in the cold car for a moment reading those 2 words and then drove home. The 12 weeks had a rhythm to them, the way programs do when they're designed well, building in the right order, each week's competencies feeding the next. Mia found the classroom work easier than she'd expected, and the simulation work harder than she'd feared, not because she couldn't do it, but because the simulation scenarios were designed to be stressful by design, and stress was still the variable she couldn't fully trust herself with. Week 3 had a scenario that she almost walked out of. It was a cardiac arrest simulation. Mannequin on the floor, controlled classroom setting, everything clearly artificial, every person in the room a student like her. She knew this. Her brain knew it completely. And still, when she got down on her knees beside the mannequin and the scenario clock started, something cold and specific moved through her that had nothing to do with the mannequin. Marcus on the kitchen floor, 43 seconds. The feeling of her feet being made of concrete. She held it. She didn't move for 2 seconds. Just 2, she counted. And then she started compressions. She finished the scenario. Not perfectly. Her hand placement was slightly off on the first cycle, and Carla corrected it without ceremony. Her voice on the radio communication was tighter than it should have been, but she finished it, and the mannequin's simulated vitals stabilized, and when the scenario ended, she sat back on her heels and breathed. Carla looked at her, not with pity, not with the particular careful attention of someone managing a problem, just a direct, level look. Good, she said. You reset mid-sequence. That's what we train for. Mia nodded once and stood up and went to get water and stood at the window for 2 minutes, letting her hands stop shaking before the next student's scenario started. She texted nobody about it that night. She sat with it alone, which was different from the old alone. Not the alone of someone shutting a door, but the alone of someone sitting with something difficult because they'd decided they could. She told Adrian about it the following Saturday at the café, while Caleb was in the back helping Jenna frost holiday cookies that were 3 weeks post-Christmas, but that Caleb had requested with such specificity that Jenna had eventually just made them. Adrian listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, 2 seconds. 2 seconds. That's down from 3, he said. At Thanksgiving, it was 3. She looked at him. She hadn't thought about it that way. The arithmetic of it. 3 seconds at Thanksgiving, 2 seconds in a controlled simulation classroom, 3 months later. The gap between the freeze and the movement, narrowing. Slowly, unevenly, Not on any schedule she could have predicted, but narrowing. That's a strange way to measure progress, she said. Is it wrong? She thought about it. No, she said. No, it's not wrong. He picked up his coffee. By the time you're back in the field, it'll be 0, or close enough. You don't know that. No, he said, but I think it. She looked out the window at the January street, gray and cold, and thought about the distance between the woman who had stood in a warehouse parking lot 2 months ago and collapsed from the weight of a life that had been packed down to nothing, and the woman sitting here now with a spiral notebook in her bag and simulation protocols memorized, and 2 seconds instead of 3. She thought about the strange and imprecise way that healing worked. Not like mending a clean break, but more like learning to walk on a leg that had healed wrong, compensating and adjusting and occasionally falling, covering ground through a combination of stubbornness and other people's steady presence, and the slow accumulation of days in which you chose, again and again, to keep going. There was no moment when it became easy. She needed to be honest about that, with herself and anyone else who might be paying attention. There was no morning she woke up and found the grief gone, found the memory of Marcus's kitchen floor wiped clean, found herself the uncomplicated person she'd been at 28 before any of this. That person was not coming back, and the sooner she stopped waiting for her, the better. What came back instead was something she hadn't anticipated. Herself, but different. Rebuilt around the loss instead of flattened by it. Carrying it without being defined by it. Still afraid of some things? Still imperfect in all the specific ways she'd always been imperfect. Still prone to the old habits of isolation and armor when things got overwhelming. But aware of them now in a way she hadn't been before, which meant she could catch them. Usually. Sometimes Caleb caught them before she did, which was both useful and slightly humbling. The clinical rotations began in week 6, which was the last week of February, when Chicago was at its most determined about winter, and the city had the slightly shell-shocked look of people who had been cold for 3 months straight and were beginning to wonder if warmth was a real thing or a collective hallucination. Mia's first rotation was at Northwestern Memorial, the same hospital where she and Adrian had sat in the waiting room the night of Caleb's allergic reaction, which she registered with a brief, quiet awareness and then set aside, because sentimentality was not a useful orientation for clinical work. She was paired with a paramedic named Dennis Okafor, 15 years in the field, deeply unimpressed by everything, and absolutely the right person to be her clinical supervisor. He didn't treat her like a returning trainee with a difficult history. He treated her like a paramedic who needed to demonstrate current competency, which was exactly correct, and she appreciated the unceremonious quality of it. Her first call was a diabetic emergency on the north side, a man in his 50s found unresponsive by his wife. Standard presentation, textbook intervention. Mia talked the wife down while Dennis ran the assessment, then took over IV access on Dennis's cue and got it on the first stick, and said, "Got it," in the level tone that means things are under control, and felt something settle into place in her chest that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. The specific feeling of competence operating without hesitation. The feeling of being useful in the precise way you were built to be useful. On the drive between calls, Dennis said, "IV access first stick on a moving unit. Good hands." "Thanks," Mia said. "I've had people with twice your hours miss that under pressure." "The pressure helps," she said, and meant it. "Clears everything else out." Dennis looked at her briefly, a lateral glance with the quality of someone recalibrating an assessment. "Reyes says you had a gap. 2 years. Why'd you stop?" She looked out the window at the February city moving past. "Personal reasons," she said. "I came back because it's what I'm actually good at." Dennis made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite skepticism, something in the professional middle. Then, "We'll see," which was, coming from him, clearly a form of respect. She texted Adrian that night from her car in the hospital parking lot. "First rotation. I didn't freeze once." He replied, "I know." She stared at those 2 words for a moment, which he kept using like a refrain, like something he'd decided was true before it proved itself. She had argued with it before. She didn't argue this time. She just drove home and made dinner and ate it at the table and looked at the photograph of Marcus on the shelf by the door and felt the specific thing that grief becomes when you've stopped fighting it. Not gone, never gone, but different. Softer around the edges. Less like a wound and more like a scar. Something that had happened to you, permanently part of your history, that you had decided to carry forward rather than be buried under. "I'm okay," she said to the photograph. Not performing it for anyone, just saying the true thing out loud, which she hadn't been able to do for a long time. She sat with the quiet for a while. Outside the window, Chicago did what it did. The incident happened on a Saturday in late March, 6 weeks before graduation from the program. During a rotation shift, she'd swapped with another student. She and Dennis were on a call in Lincoln Park, a playground, a child, a frantic parent on the phone with dispatch saying the child had just collapsed and was not responsive. They were 3 minutes out when the call came through. Mia ran the scenario in her head on the way. Probable causes, probable age range, probable interventions. The mental preparation that had come back to her like breathing, like something her mind did automatically once she'd given it permission to operate again. They pulled up, and the child was a girl, maybe 4 years old, lying on the rubber mulch beside a climbing structure, lips bluing in the specific way that Mia recognized from a November café 4 months ago. The mother was on her knees beside her, and the sound she was making was not words, just sound, the specific frequency of a parent watching their child and being unable to do anything. Mia was out of the unit before it fully stopped. She did not freeze, not for a second, not for a half second. She moved with the clean focus that Carla Reyes had called being fully in your body, the thing that had taken her 6 years to build the first time and 3 months to rebuild, the thing that had been hers all along, waiting under 2 years of avoidance and guilt and a cold apartment with dead plants on the windowsill. The child had an undiagnosed allergy. The body's response was swift and severe, and Mia recognized it immediately. Epinephrine from the kit, positioning, airway management, monitoring, radio to the hospital while Dennis drove, her voice on the line steady and precise, giving exactly the information that would be needed on the receiving end. The little girl's color came back in the ambulance. Her breathing stabilized. By the time they reached the hospital, she was conscious, frightened, crying in the specific way of a child who wants her mother, which was the best possible sound. In the ambulance bay, the ER team took over, and Mia stepped back and stood there for a moment in the cold March air with her hands at her sides. Dennis came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "That was clean." "Yeah," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "You know what you did there." "I do." He looked at her sideways. "You want to talk about it?" "No," she said. "I want to do it again tomorrow." He made that sound again, the not quite agreement, but this time there was something else in it that hadn't been there before. "Good answer," he said, and went back into the unit. Mia stood in the ambulance bay a moment longer. The March air was cold in the way that late winter is cold. A different cold from January, less absolute, with something underneath it that might eventually be spring. She tilted her face up briefly, eyes closed, and just breathed. She thought about a 6-year-old boy in a cafe with a blue mitten. She thought about a man who had sat down beside her on cold concrete without asking permission. She thought about a napkin heart with her name in marker, still on her refrigerator. She thought about 43 seconds in a kitchen 2 years ago, and she thought about 0 seconds today. She took out her phone and called Adrian. Not texted, called. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, hey," she paused. "I need to tell you something." "What happened?" "Nothing bad." She leaned against the ambulance bay wall. "I want to tell you about a little girl in Lincoln Park." She told him. Not the clinical version, not the compressed professional summary, the real version, with the mother sound and the rubber mulch and the specific color of the child's lips and the way her own hands had just moved without asking her permission, without fear, without the old concrete feeling in her feet. She told him about the child's color coming back and the sound of her crying for her mother, which was the best sound. Adrian was quiet through most of it, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment longer, and she could hear the weight of his listening, the particular quality of attention she'd gotten used to from him that made her feel like what she was saying was the only thing happening in his world right now. "Mia," he said. "Yeah, I'm proud of you." He said it straight, without wrapping it in anything. "Not because of what you did today? I mean, yes, because of that. but more because of everything between November and right now. All of it. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ambulance bay ceiling and did not cry, because she was on shift and crying on shift was not something she was going to do. Don't make me emotional in an ambulance bay. You called me. I know, she said. I know I did. A beat. Come for dinner tonight, he said. Caleb's been asking for 2 weeks when you're coming over. He's made a list of things he wants to show you. A list. A physical list. On paper, numbered. She laughed, and it was not the brief, contained, almost laugh of the woman who had sat across from him at a blind date 4 months ago. It was a real one, unguarded, the kind that comes from being genuinely surprised by joy. Okay, she said. Yeah, I'll come. She came for dinners that night, and Caleb met her at the door with the paper list, which was 7 items long and written in his large print second-grade hand, and included things like show Mia my new T-Rex and teach Mia the card trick and ask Mia about the ambulance. She held the list with appropriate seriousness and told him they would get through all 7 items, which they did, mostly, except item 6, which was watch the dinosaur documentary, and which ran long and absorbed Caleb completely, and eventually him sideways on the couch, asleep with his feet against Mia's leg and the television still going. Adrian turned the volume down from across the room and looked at his son, and then at Mia, who was sitting at one end of the couch with a glass of wine, and Caleb's socked feet against her thigh, and the specific expression of someone who was somewhere they had decided to be. He does this every time, Adrian said quietly, not wanting to wake him. Full commitment to being awake, and then just gone. He's like a light switch, Mia said, equally quiet. All the way on, and then all the way off. Diana was like that, he said. She'd be the last person talking at any dinner party, and then she'd fall asleep in the car before we got out of the parking garage. He said it easily, the way he'd been learning to say Diana's name. Not without weight, but without the old flinching quality. The way you learn to carry something over time. The weight the same, but the carrying different. I used to do the same thing with her in the car that he's doing to you now. The feet thing? She'd fall asleep with her feet in my lap every time. Mia looked at him. Something moved between them in the quiet of the room, with the child asleep and the television showing silent footage of something Cretaceous and the city outside dark and cold, but with the faint edge of March that was starting tentatively to consider spring. Can I say something? She said. Yeah. She looked at Caleb for a moment. At his bear's hat, which he'd worn to dinner and was now slightly askew. At the list he'd made on paper, still on the cushion beside her, 7 items with careful handwriting. Then she looked at Adrian, who was watching her with the quiet directness that she'd come to understand was not intensity for its own sake, but just the particular way he was, fully present, not performing it, just there. I didn't come here that night in November looking for anything, she said. I want you to know I know that. I came because I owed Jenna a yes, and because I was trying to be a person again, and because I needed to start somewhere. She paused. I didn't come here looking for you specifically. I know, he said, and I want you to know that matters to me. The not looking part. Because things you don't look for, that find you anyway. She stopped. Found the words again. They feel real in a different way. You can't take credit for engineering them. They just are what they are. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, looking at her. Where are you going with this? I'm going somewhere, she said. I need you to let me get there in my own way. He made a small gesture that meant, clearly, I'm not going anywhere. She took a breath. I think I love your son, she said. I want to say that first, separately, because it's separate. It's not about you. He's just... She looked at Caleb asleep. He's just his own complete thing, and I love him. Adrian's face did something that wasn't a smile and wasn't tears and was some complicated territory between those two things. And I think... She paused. I think what I feel about you is real enough that I'm scared of it, which you told me was the right measure. So, she met his eyes. I'm telling you. The room was very quiet. You're telling me you're scared, he said carefully. I'm telling you I'm in, she said, despite being scared, or because of it. Both. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. The man who had buried himself in work for 3 years, who had set 2 coffee cups out without thinking and slept on his couch and built a billion-dollar company to have somewhere to put the energy that had nowhere to go. The man who had told her, in a hospital waiting room, that he hadn't cried about his wife until Caleb cried first, and that the guilt of a single missed flight had sat in him like a stone for 3 years. Not a simple man, not a fixed man, a man still doing the work of being alive, the same work she was doing, just from his own specific corner of grief. "I'm in too," he said. "I've been in for a while. I was just waiting to say it until you were ready." She looked at him. "How long is a while?" "Since the waiting room," he admitted. "Night of Caleb's reaction. You handed me a paper coffee cup and sat 2 seats away and said you'd be there when I came back out." She blinked. That's 4 months ago." "I know. You waited 4 months." "You needed 4 months," he said without accusation. "And I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't going to push. This only works if it's real, and real things don't work on anyone else's timeline." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You're a lot, Adrian Hayes." "I know," he said. "You mentioned that once before, in a parking lot. I stand by it." "I know that too." Caleb shifted in his sleep, turning further onto his side, his feet pressing slightly more into Mia's leg with the complete indifference of a sleeping child who had decided this arrangement was correct and did not require approval. She put her hand on his ankle, just resting it there, and the gesture was so natural and so unpremeditated that neither of them remarked on it. "What happens now?" she said quietly. "I don't know exactly," Adrian said. "I don't think we're supposed to know exactly. What do you know?" He looked at his son, at her hand on his son's ankle, at the woman on his couch who had walked through a café door in November looking for the exit and had instead, by degrees, become the most real presence in his life. "I know I'm not afraid of your grief," he said, "and you're not afraid of mine. And I know that's—" He paused, choosing carefully. "That's rarer than people think. Most people run from other people's pain. You didn't, I didn't." "That's a low bar," she said. "It's not a low bar," he said, firmly but without heat. "It's actually the bar. Everything else is detail." She considered this. Outside the windows, Chicago was doing something with the clouds that made the light through the glass shift, briefly, into something warmer than winter had any right to produce. "Okay," she said. "Then I know that too." Mia graduated from the Northwestern Recertification Program on a Friday evening in late April, in a room that smelled like industrial coffee and dry erase markers, with 11 other people who had various complicated routes back to emergency medicine, and none of whom would ever fully know each other's reasons. Carla Reyes shook her hand at the end and said, "You're one of the better students I've had through this program. Don't waste it." Which was, from Carla, a significant statement. Jenna was in the back of the room and cried openly and didn't apologize for it. Adrian was beside her, not crying, but with the look of someone who had to work at not crying, which she recognized because she'd seen it on him before. Caleb was on Adrian's other side in a too small dress shirt and his Bears hat, holding a sign he'd made himself that said, "MIA is a hero" in large block letters, with a paramedic truck drawn below it in what appeared to be at least 6 different colors. When Mia walked out into the lobby afterward and saw the sign, she stopped walking completely for 1 second. Then she crossed the room and went to Caleb and crouched down and said, "Did you make that yourself?" "Me and Dad," he said. "Dad did the letters because mine were too small, but I did the truck. The truck is excellent." He held it up to show her more clearly. "I put lights on it," he said, pointing to small orange marks along the roof. "Because ambulances have lights." "They do," she said. "You got that exactly right." She stood up and looked at Adrian, and the look between them was not a culmination and was not a beginning and was not the neat resolution point of anything. It was just 2 people who had found their way to being honest with each other, standing in a room with bad lighting and industrial coffee smell, not cleaned up or perfected, just real. He held out her jacket, which she'd left on her chair, and said, "Hungry? Caleb has strong opinions about where we celebrate." "The pizza place," Mia said. "He already texted them," Adrian confirmed. "He asked if they could put the good booth on hold." "He texted a restaurant." "From my phone. I found out afterward." She shook her head, and the laugh came easily now, naturally, without the old struggle against it. Jenna, behind them, made a sound of pure satisfaction that she didn't bother trying to disguise. They went to the pizza place and they got the good booth, and Caleb ate an amount of pizza that was medically inadvisable for his body weight and argued the pineapple question again with new supporting evidence he had apparently been developing for months. And Jenna drank 2 glasses of wine and gave a toast that was embarrassing in the way she'd warned them about. And Adrian paid the check before anyone could argue about it. And when they walked out into the April night, the air had finally, actually, turned. Not warm yet, not Chicago spring warm, which was its own fragile and tentative thing, but different from winter, carrying something in it that winter didn't have. The specific atmospheric quality of a city remembering it knew how to be something other than cold. Caleb walked ahead of them on the sidewalk, the sign tucked under his arm, hat on, narrating something to himself about the pizza that the adults behind him couldn't fully hear. Jenna had peeled off for her car with the energy of someone who had accomplished exactly what she set out to accomplish and was going home satisfied. Adrian and Mia walked behind Caleb, not quite side by side in the deliberate sense, just close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched in the unpredictable way of 2 people walking in the same direction on an uneven sidewalk. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Done with the program." She thought about it honestly. "Like standing at the top of a staircase and looking down at all the steps," she said. "You're glad you climbed them, but what you actually feel is aware of how many there were." "That's it," he said. "That's exactly it." "How'd you feel when you first made your first million?" she asked. "Or whenever the company first became whatever it became?" "Terrified," he said, "and then immediately worried I'd lose it." He paused. "And then I called Jenna, and she made it worse by being too excited, which somehow helped." Mia smiled. "She has that effect." "She does," he agreed. Ahead of them, Caleb stopped at a puddle of reflected streetlight on the wet April sidewalk and jumped in it with both feet, then turned around to check if anyone had seen. He found both of them watching him. He looked slightly guilty for half a second, then decided against guilt and jumped again. "Caleb," Adrian said without real force. "It's water," Caleb said. "It's just water, Dad." Mia looked at the puddle. She was wearing her good shoes. She thought about this for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked over and jumped in the puddle with him. Caleb screamed with delight. Adrian stood on the dry sidewalk with the expression of a man who had not prepared for this development. Mia looked back at him from the puddle, water on her shoes, completely undignified. "It's just water," she said. He looked at her. He looked at his son. He looked at the puddle. He stepped in. Caleb lost his mind entirely. He jumped up and down and the sign fell in the puddle, and he retrieved it and held it up, dripping. And the 3 of them stood in a sidewalk puddle in April in Chicago, getting their feet wet for no functional reason at all. And the sign still said MIA is a hero in letters Adrian had made large enough to read from across a room. And the ambulance truck still had its 6-color lights. And the April air was cold but not winter cold. And Caleb was laughing in the full-body way of a child who is genuinely, completely happy. And Mia was laughing for real, the unguarded kind. And Adrian was looking at both of them with the look of a man who had been in the dark for a long time and had forgotten, until now, what it felt like when the lights came back on. Not fixed, not resolved into something simple, not free of the weight they each carried, the 43 seconds, the missed flight, the coffee cup set for 1 person when there used to be 2. Those things were permanent. They were always going to be permanent. But permanent things and living things can coexist. That was the truth neither of them had been willing to believe for a long time. That you could carry the dead and still make room for the living. That grief was not a life sentence. The 2 people who understood devastation could, if they were stubborn enough and honest enough and lucky enough to find each other, build something new from it. Not instead of what they'd lost, but alongside it. As a different thing. A true thing. The life you build after the one you planned doesn't look the way you expected. It's messier and more tentative and scarred in places you didn't expect to be scarred. It has a 6-year-old's socked feet in your lap, and a refrigerator with a napkin hard on it, and a photograph you put back on the shelf after 2 years in a box. It has a man who waits 4 months because he knows you need the time and shows up anyway, consistent and quiet, and not afraid of your worst nights. It has a sister who sets up blind dates in her café and cries openly in recertification program lobbies and calls it love, which it is. It doesn't feel like a second chance exactly. That framing implies the first chance was the real one, and this is a lesser thing. That's not right. It just feels like life. Continuing, complicated, ongoing, asking something of you every day, offering something back when you're willing to take it. Caleb eventually ran out of puddle-related enthusiasm and declared he needed ice cream, which was an aggressive position given the April temperature, but which he held with conviction. And they walked the rest of the block to the ice cream shop that was technically closed for the season, but had a sign in the window that said open weekends and was therefore open, and they sat at a small table in a too-cold ice cream shop, eating things that made no weather sense. And Caleb explained something about the criminal underrepresentation of mint chocolate chip in popular culture, and Mia countered that strawberry was the more underrated choice. And Adrian said nothing and ate his single scoop of vanilla, which both of them called boring, and which he defended on the grounds that vanilla done well was the most honest flavor, which somehow turned into a 10-minute conversation about honesty and ice cream, and whether honesty was the same as simplicity. It was an argument that resolved nothing. They walked out into the April night with no conclusion reached, Caleb between them holding both their hands, swinging slightly with each step, the sign under his arm with Mia's name still legible through the puddle damage. The city moved around them, indifferent and enormous and alive. They walked, and the night held them in the ordinary way that nights hold the living, without ceremony, without announcement, without anything more dramatic than the simple fact of continuing. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly everything.